Hello there, I'm Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and I've got another doozy of a tutorial for you. This is hopefully the first part of a long series of advanced dynamics tutorials. The goal here being is that not only can we learn in a more detailed way the way dynamics behave in Cinema 4D, but to be able to artistically direct, to take control of your simulations and be able to have them do exactly what you want them to do. Now, in this tutorial, we're going to be tackling this collapsing ground technique, where it's going to be spreading out. We're going to get little chunks moving up into the air. They're all going to be tilting and tapering downward into the ground. We're going to be forming cracks on the edge. That's all really fun. But it's broken up into two main parts. The first part is going to be doing the actual simulation, the dynamics, driving different parts, getting fields and growth to be working. If you want to learn a whole bunch about the freeze growth technique inside of fields and really have an understanding of the way it behaves, this is going to be really useful. The second part of the tutorial is going to be trying to make it look pretty. I'm going to be spending a little bit of time in Redshift. We're going to be using a bunch of plugins to quickly try and make it look a little bit nicer and not spend that much time on that, because the point here is the advanced dynamics techniques. So with that said, if you like what you see, a thumbs up is always great. Give me comments for additional tutorials you might like to see, or maybe something you made based off of this, or suggestions of something I might have done wrong and how I can improve on it. So with no further ado, let's dive right on into this tutorial. Okay, let's begin with a slightly simplified version of our rig. I'm going to assume that you don't have too much familiarity with dynamics, so we're going to go through step by step on this. So let's go ahead and create a cube, and I'm going to put in some pretty precise numbers here. We're going to type in on X 2000, on Y 50, on Z 2000. And my reason for choosing these numbers is we're going to be making several objects of the same scale, so being precise is useful. And also, if you want your dynamics to behave in a similar way to mine, the same kind of chunk size, then putting the same numbers in is a good idea. But keep in mind, overall, this is an arbitrary number. You don't have to use this amount by any means. So, having said that, let's create our next object. It's going to be a MoGraph Voronoi Fracture. And now we can go ahead and take our cube, drop in the Voronoi Fracture, and boom, you can see that we have all these nice little chunks. Now, I like seeing the edges in this kind of mode, so I like hitting the shortcut NB. Another shortcut is NA, and it's going to be changing your display mode like this from one mode that we can see the lines and a mode that we don't see the lines. Very useful shortcut to have. So NB, we can now see our individual lines, looking really good. Now, let's go ahead and throw a dynamics tag on here right away so we can see a simplified version of this. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the Voronoi Fracture. We're going to click on Simulation. We're going to create a rigid body tag. Now, all we have to do is hit play, and boom, instantly all of our pieces are going to be falling down. Gravity's taking over. It's calculating really quick. Now, a couple reasons why this is calculating really quick. These are convex shapes, which means they don't have any kind of interior. There's no hole inside of them. And the curve, there's never like a little divot or a pit where they could interlock with each other. So it makes it so the dynamics can calculate really quick. So that is useful right there. It runs really fast. But there is something I want to point out. As soon as I hit play and these start falling down, you're going to see they're going to start drifting apart from each other a little bit. You can see there's a little bit of them floating away. And the reason for that is in dynamics, there's a margin built in. There's a little bit of like almost like a force field around it to detect if it's colliding with other objects. And we want to turn that off. So let's go ahead and rewind to 0. It's always good to be making changes for dynamics at the time of 0. So let's go ahead to our dynamics settings, our project settings. So I'm going to hit Control or Command D. And that's going to pop open your project settings. Go ahead and click on the Dynamics tab here. And under the Expert tab, you're going to see we have a collision margin, and the current collision margin is set to a default of 1. Set that to 0. And now if we hit play, it should be still running nice and fast. We're going to see they're not drifting apart from each other because it didn't have that collision margin in there. You can see that pretty precisely they're still falling down. And that extra level of accuracy is pretty important depending on the way you're running your rig. So let's go ahead and give this scene file a quick save. I've already got it saved as number 1 for breaking ground. And let's move to the next part. So we need more chunks here. We need more subdivisions. So if we click on our Voronoi Fracture, we can go to our point distribution. Also keep in mind we should be at the time of 0 for dynamics. And even there, you see it's supposed to be up in the air. So I can hit the letter S, which is going to jump me up to where my object is. S for zoom in on selection. And now under sources, we can click on point generation, and we have our number of points. So we can type in any number we want there, or I can click and drag, and as I drag up, you can see it's creating additional points and subdividing more times. There's kind of Voronoi Fracture is great in a bunch of ways, where it calculates really quick, it looks really neat, and mathematically what's happening is it's generating these random points and then finding the halfway point between them and generating a line that is perpendicular to it. And where all of those different intersections happen is how it's being generated. So that's pretty cool. But the problem is that Voronoi Fracture chunks look very uniform. There's a very specific look to them, and I'd like to get away from that a little bit here. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is grab our point amount and let's bring it way up. I'm going to go to like 2,222 because it's quick to type. And look at all these chunks. We're already running a little bit slower. And just to throw it out there, if we hit play, the dynamics are going to be running. But you're going to see it's going to be taking a lot longer. We've dropped down to about 1 frame a second here. But you know what? That's still pretty good considering we have this many chunks. But that's important to point out because it's about to get a lot slower still. But before we get there, let's go ahead and go to our Geometry Glue tab and do something really neat. Inside of our Geometry Glue, we can go ahead and enable it. And we have a glue type right now. And I want the glue type to not be fall off. I want it to be cluster. And this is the most useful version of it to me, because what we can do is, based on the existing chunks, merge them together until we have exactly this cluster amount. So we got 5 clusters. I'm going to type in 777. So at that point, we have about an average of maybe 3 chunks per object. And now you can see that we have much more interesting shapes. Now, some of them still might just be 1 chunk, but some of them obviously are like 1, 2, 3, even maybe 4 chunks merged together. And this really gets away from the Voronoi look, that generic kind of Voronoi fracturing look. And I just really like the way that those all combine. Now, a problem here is if we hit play, we're going to see it's going to, well, first of all, it's going to explode. And it's exploding because now these shapes can be concave. So you get these little divots in here where this is interlocking with another piece. And Cinema 4D is calculating the concave version, so there's actually almost like an invisible line that's going across here, which is saying like, oh, okay, cool, nothing's intersecting, but then this is intersecting, thus they explode away. So in order for it to calculate more accurately, we have to go back into our dynamics tag, and we have to change the shape from automatic to moving mesh. And now that we've done that, it's actually calculating every single polygon. But what that means is it's going to take a lot longer to calculate. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play here. And let's just see how long this takes to calculate a single frame. So let's see, it's going to calculate, and we got to be watch. Boom, right there. Boom, it finally calculated one. You see we're getting 0.2. It's going very, very slowly to do these calculations, but that's the price that we pay for having it do this type of intersecting so it can actually run on those individual chunks. But now that we've done that, let's go ahead and stop it from playing, rewind. Something that we can do, and I find myself doing this more and more experimentally with dynamics, is under our dynamics tag, under the collision tab, we have a checkbox called self collisions. If we turn that off, then these are no longer worried about colliding with each other. And because our Voronoi fracture is a single object, self refers to the entire object. And now if I hit play, they're all just going to fall away really quickly. So that is great. And if we were to create a floor here, let's pull that floor way down. I'm going to add a dynamics tag to it. Let's go ahead and hit play. Now we can see that they're going to hit the ground and bounce around and be dynamic, but they're not worried about colliding with each other. So with that in mind, we don't need that floor. And let's go ahead and take a look at a couple other things. So now we've got our dynamics running relatively quickly on some significantly more complex objects. And we can go ahead into our Voronoi fracture and we can do some cool things like click on our cluster seed, and we can click on that, and every time I click through, we're going to get a different arrangement of them being combined in different ways. I kind of like to look at that one. And let's see what else. Well, something else is we've got these green dots here, and this is us previewing the source. And as long as we have this point generator selected, we're going to be seeing these points. We could deselect that. We could also select it and then turn off this eyeball. So now those are not visually showing up in the viewport. So either of those are fine. It's just good to get rid of those so we can see everything a little bit more clearly here. So now we've got a nice series of chunks on here. Let's go ahead and give ourselves another quick save. I'm going to save as another version, number 2. And now we can go ahead and begin actually driving the actual kind of procedural growth here so that we can see it fall away. So let's go ahead and begin by, in our Voronoi fracture, creating a MoGraph selection tag. We need to be able to have something that will grow. So let's go to MoGraph tags. We're going to go to MoGraph selection. And now we've got an empty MoGraph selection tag. You see we got all these nice little brown dots here, which is one per clone, one per chunk here. So in order to control this, we could draw selections, but we don't want to do that. We want to go to our tag, go to the tag tab, and then go to use fields, turn that on, and now we are using the new R20 fields. The freeze here is just any already selected points. We don't have any selected points, so let's go ahead and delete that. And let's go ahead and we could either select one point, which I don't want to do because we want to drive it entirely with fields. I'm going to go ahead and create a spherical fall off. And the instant I do, we're going to see a couple of points get selected right away. So if you were to grab this spherical field here, click on the move tool, and I move this around, any point that falls within the threshold is going to automatically be selected. But you know what? I only want one point to be selected, so let's go ahead and very carefully select the orange dot there, and I can drag it to shrink down. And you can see I have a single point. I can probably grab this middle fall off radius and increase it all the way so it's kind of a full fall off. You're in the circle or you're not. And let's just make sure a single point is selected. That is looking good. And now we can use that to drive additional things. So with a single point selected, what we can do is go into our dynamics tag and go back to the dynamics tab. You can see that there's a setting here which is dynamics on, which just means all of our different chunks here are on. But what we can do is drag in this selection tag, this MoGraph selection tag, into the selection that's corresponding with that. And now only things that have been selected are going to be turned on. So I can go ahead and hit play, and you're going to see that fall away, which is awesome. Look at that, just drop right out of the scene, falls out. Now, an important thing to note as well is if we take a look at the way these chunks are existing here, if we didn't have these dynamic pieces falling through, if they couldn't fall through the rest of the object because of the collision, if we didn't have self-collisions on, then that chunk couldn't fall through because it'd be kind of sitting on that little ledge. I'm going to keep that off, but you'd see it actually wouldn't be able to pass through because it'd be sitting on this nice little seat here and it would not fall away. So this is sort of another advantage of turning off our self-collisions here. Of course, there's some disadvantages, but we could also leave it turned on, and then as we spread out, then it would start activating and eventually chunks could fall away. And I think we will do a little bit of that as a test, but for now we can continue to ignore it. So let's go back to our selection, MoGraph selection tag, and we want to begin some nice simple growth here. So let's go ahead and add on the new modifier that we're going to need. We can click on this clamp by default, but this is the modifier layers drop down, and we're going to create a freeze. So we've got a new freeze turned on here, but it's nice and clean. Something I like doing is hitting the clear button right away, because what tends to happen is it will see whatever the initial state was and store that, and we don't want that to happen. So what we need this to do is be on blending mode add, because we want it to see what's below it and then add on its own effect instead of completely overriding what was below. And what we want to do is change the mode inside of it from none to grow. So now it's going to be attempting to grow the current selection. If I were to hit play though, we're not really going to see anything happen. And that is because we have two different settings here, a radius and an effect strength. And I'm not sure how far apart these points are. So something I like doing as a measuring stick here is just creating a cube and scaling this down and just kind of seeing what the size of an average chunk is, which is maybe about that. And I can see that's about 83. So all this means is in our fields, anything below 83, I think has almost no chance of spreading to the next one because these points just aren't that close. So let's go ahead and type in something around that range. So I'm just going to type in 100, which is just a little bit bigger, and let's hit play and see what happens. Oh, there we go. Look at that. The instant we put in a pretty big number, you can see this spread very quickly, and all the dynamics are spreading and falling away, and every single chunk falls except for one, which is a particularly big chunk, which I guess is just a little too far away from this value of 100, and it just can't catch it. So now that we see this, let's go ahead and take a look at what exactly is happening. So on the first frame, the first point is selected, and then when we go one frame forward, everything within the range of 100 of that point is selected. And if we go forward one more frame again, anything within 100 of the new selection will grow. So you can see we kind of get this exponential growth where every single frame, the next range is being selected. So that's pretty cool. but it's spreading really quickly. So if we want to have a little bit more artistic control over this, we need to go ahead and start lowering our effect strength. Right now, 100% of the power is being applied if it's in range, but we can go ahead and drop this down to maybe 10%. So now only 10% of the power is being applied, and you'll see, this is important, we have a tolerance of 50%. So until it's at least 50% power, it doesn't get selected. So if I hit play right now, you're going to see it's going to take longer for it to spread out. It has to essentially spend 5 frames in range before it can be activated. Now, what we can do is change our tolerance. Let's drive that all the way down to 0 and hit play. And now it's going to take even longer. It's a little counterintuitive. I would think that we'd want to go up to 100%, but 100% means they're all going to be selected right away. And if we drive our tolerance down to 0, then the selection has to build up to that. So now it's going to take 10 frames before it actually gets selected. 10 frames of getting 10, then 20, then 30% until it goes all the way up to 100, and then it can spread out. But now we have this much more artistic way that we can have this begin to spread out. And that's pretty cool. We can now have them fall in a much more controlled manner. Now, something I like doing in addition to that is making our radius even larger than that, making it something like 200 or maybe even 300, and keeping the effect strength pretty low. But that means that can spread out to maybe the 2 chunks beyond, and maybe catch that one that we didn't see. But then, and actually I'm not sure about, I'm curious, I don't know the answer to this, but if 1 point is in range of 2 points, does it get double applied, or is it still just single applied? I'm not sure about that. But by increasing our radius, you're going to see that they're going to fall a little bit more uniformly, but the spread is a little bit more confident, and I think we're going to be less likely to have chunks get left behind. You can see when this was back to 100, we get a couple floaters for a second. You can see that, like this chunk right there, that big one, is staying there, and it's floating for a little bit before it can fall. But by increasing our radius to 200, it is now catching it more quickly and it can fall away. Now we could counteract this by dropping our effect strength down to 5%. And now they should start falling slower again. But you can see that we didn't get that little leftover that was left behind. So, just these 2 controls actually go a really long way to putting some additional control in. Some sort of artistic control. So, yeah, that's pretty much the basics of getting these chunks to fall away. Now, something I think would probably be pretty useful to talk about. Let's go ahead and give this a quick save. Actually, let's save it as the next version. So I want to show you what those dynamics might look like if we were running them fully here. But there's just way too many chunks here for it to calculate quickly for the purpose of the tutorial. So I'm going to, you don't have to follow along for this part, but just as an example, I'm going to deselect my MoGraph selection tag because that will mess me up. I'm going to select my Voronoi Fracture, and let's go ahead and apply a MoGraph plane effector. And I don't want to move up, but I do want to affect the visibility. So as soon as I turn on that visibility, I can go to fall off and create a spherical fall off. And now anything that falls in the radius will be generated. Everything outside of it won't be. What that means is I can really easily go to my dynamics tag and I can hit self collisions, and now we get the collisions going. And then we can actually see this go and calculate. And you can see it's taking a while for the pieces to fall away because the other pieces around it are catching them. And with them catching them, we get kind of this interesting effect. And it could be cool and it could be something you want to do. And you can go ahead and leave that turned on and bake it down so you actually get it. But there are a couple of problems that I have found happen. Like you get this really nice kind of cascading falling effect, which is something that we want. But pieces can get stuck on each other. They're going to be intersecting. They can freak out. And even here, it's going to be hard to tell in real time. But you see we get this pretty strong vibration happening, like all this vibration. And it tends to break the overall effect. And it's just the way they're intersecting. You're going to get a lot of pieces passing through each other. So even with this few chunks, we'd have to go and really crank up our steps per frame. So let's go ahead and hit Control or Command D, back to Dynamics, back to Expert, and we have our steps per frame, which is how many calculations happen per frame. I'm going to jump it up to something like 25. But now it's going to take 5 times as long to do those calculations as it goes. They're a lot more precise, and you see them falling away, and that should look cleaner. But you see they're still having trouble going through. They start passing through still. This one's getting shoved up in the air. Like it's just, there's a little bit of jitter and a lack of kind of artistic control that makes it so that, like, yeah, see that one's flying away. Now, that could be fine. It could be artistically, you might love that. So, I just want to put out there that, yes, this is totally something you can do. It's not the technique we're aiming for. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to steps per frame, drop that back down to 5, and we can go ahead and delete our plane. And let's go ahead and make sure that our self collisions are off again because we don't need to worry about those. I'm going to hit save. If you are using the dynamics that way, it might be a good idea as well to click on the Dynamics tab, go to the Collision tab, and then lower your bounce and your friction and your collision noise. That might give you a little bit more control, but I have done that, and I still get the jitter. I still don't have that level of control that I want. With that in mind, we're going to be transferring all of the animation and motion. We're not going to be doing that via Dynamics on this Voronoi Fracture. We're going to turn this off, so hold down Control or Command. And we're going to be driving it on a plane object, which should go much faster. Our first step on this new plane object is setting it to be the same scale as the original cube. So let's go to 2000 by 2000. Nice round number. And then we need to subdivide it. I'm going to go to 55 by 55 because visually that's about the size of the chunks. So there's probably going to be about a polygon per chunk. And it should still run really quick. So let's go ahead and we're going to be making a couple objects. So let's stay really organized. Let's rename this ground reference. And now we need to add a VertexMap Tag onto it so we can control our vertex weights. Let's go ahead and make it editable. And we have to go to selection. Looks like we have to click on point mode first. And now we can go to selection, set vertex weight. They'll pop open the dialog box here. And let's just go and hit OK. So what has happened is we have now got a VertexMap Tag here. And what this enables us to do is assign a value from 0 to 100% on every single point of this object. It allows us to, in a very visual way, assign a value of 100% on yellow and 0% as red. So we can control this automatically using fields. So let's go ahead and click on our tag and click the Use Fields checkbox. Oh, in addition, let's go ahead and name our vertex map. I'm going to go to Basic, and we have Vertex Map, and I'm going to call it Vertex Map Growth, because we're going to have a couple of these. So, going back to the Fields tab, we're going to do very similar setup. And you know what? We're going to get really specific here, because I feel like this technique is one of the most... It's very important to understand to make fields controllable and useful. Otherwise, you're just kind of throwing numbers out there. So let's go ahead and do it again, and then we're going to go even deeper. So I'm going to delete the freeze. Let's go ahead and drag that same spherical field in, which should be useful here. And let's go ahead and move it onto a point. So I could just move it carefully, and you can see as soon as I touch a point, it's going to automatically light up as yellow. But you can also hit Shift-S, which is snapping, and I can move this around, and it's going snap, 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 snap to all of our points. So we can just go ahead and make sure we're snapped to a point, and then hit Shift-S again, and now we're no longer snapping. So we can see that this middle point has got a value of 100% because it's full yellow, and these have 0%, and there's a gradient in between. Excellent. Now what's great about R20 and fields is now we have vertex maps which have become these universal translators of one type of data to another. And it's really great, and they run really fast, and it's really visual. So let's go ahead and set up our growth again. I'm going to click on our vertex tag, and we've got our spherical field. Let's go ahead and create another freeze from the modifier layers dropdown. We're going to set that to add, otherwise it just doesn't work. And under layer, let's make sure that we are set to growth. And like I said, I'm going to hit the clear checkbox or the clear box because it might record that original point and then we wouldn't have control over it. So I like clearing it. Otherwise, you can end up with some weirdness later. You don't know why. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what our distance is between any given point so we know how to set our radius. So let's go ahead and just select 2 points. We can be very precise here. 2 points, and now we can see that our size is 36 and some change. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and set our radius to 37, so it's just a little bit bigger. And with that, all we should have to do is hit play, and boom, spreading out. Now you're going to see a very obviously distinct pattern here. It's kind of this diamond pattern, and that's because it can only spread to the points that are kind of in these cardinal directions. The kitty corner one is too far away for it to catch, so it's not rounded at all. So we can automatically start making this a little bit more controllable, a little bit rounder by doubling that amount. So let's say times 2. And as soon as we say times 2, it can actually spread out to this more square-esque pattern. So we hit play, and boom, you're going to see it's going to be a lot more square. It's not perfectly square. It's a little more square. And in fact, it's a little rounder. And I think rounder is good. So if we go back to 37 instead of times 2, let's say times 3. and go ahead and hit play, then now it's even rounder still. And so that's actually working great for our purposes. Let's go ahead and lower our effect strength to slow it down overall. So I'm going to do 10%. So now it should be slowly spreading out on a larger radius, slowly getting more power. And now you see we have something that's quite round. And it's spreading out relatively slowly. It's still pretty quick, but I like the way this is looking. And look at this instant automatic feedback that we're getting. It's working really well. Now let's go ahead and give this file a quick save because we're going to do something interesting. Save it as number 5. And what I'm going to do is let's turn on our Voronoi Fracture. And this is an interesting bug I've been running into sometimes with the Voronoi Fracture, so I'm kind of glad it happened. If we go into our Voronoi Fracture, I think there's a bug in the source, this point generation. So I've tried like doing different things to turn it on and off, but the only thing I can do is delete. So I can hit delete on point generation and add the distribution source back in, and now it comes back. Not sure why it does that, but let's just type in 2222, and it should be the exact same pattern. So yeah, not sure why that happens, but it does. Okay. What we're going to do is let's run our dynamics on it, and they're currently not colliding. With them not colliding, in fact, if they're not colliding, I think we could probably put this back to automatic. So with them not colliding, what we could do is say drive our selection tag here via not the spherical field and grow. Let's go and delete those. Instead, let's drive it with this vertex map. Let's drag in our vertex map growth. And now it's automatically trying to find the nearest vertex point. So hopefully, when we hit play here, you're going to see, yeah, it's working pretty much perfectly. I did forget to hide our distribution points. And we still have the plane there. So let's hide our ground plane. But you can now see that we're getting the growth from our ground plane, but is then applying to our objects to make them dynamic. So how much more visual is it to see the way that this growth is happening here? Like, obviously it's kind of circular, but we don't get that much resolution from it. So by turning that off, let's rewind to 0, turn that off. Let's unhide our ground plane. Now, anything that we do to update this will be updating the way that our Voronoi Fracture is activating in the dynamics. So, but look how visual that this is in order for us to control that. So that is really powerful right there. So let's go ahead and give this another save. And now we can go ahead and push this further. And this is where Fields gets crazy. We're going to be doing it in a very simple, precise way, but Fields is crazy. And one of the ways it's crazy is if we go back inside of our vertex map, we have a freeze, and we're currently controlling the layer, and we have a radius, which is 3 times the distance of one point to another point. But you're going to see we have another tab called radius. And this radius has its own fields. It has subfields. So this is a single parameter, which is kind of automatically controlling the radius parameter. And now we can feed more fields into that. And so stuff gets pretty crazy. So right now, the radius has got nothing in there. So it's just getting 100% applied all the time, which means it's getting applied 100% of the radius every time. So that means it's always spreading 3 points away. But what we can do is start feeding in some other things into here. We can feed in a noise, for example. So let's go ahead, instead of using a shader field, let's just use a nice straightforward field object of the random field. You see we create a new random field. Something I like doing is making a child of the object just so I know that these are related to each other. It doesn't actually change anything. Now that we get this random field in there, it is going to be applying essentially from 0 to 100% onto it. And if something is applied 100%, then the radius will be full. And if it's 0%, the radius will be 0. And every number in between will be some in-between number. So based on that, if we click on our random field, we can go ahead and say, actually, let's just leave it this way and hit play and see what we get. Oh, look at that. We're getting a pretty interesting pattern right away. Now, if we want chunks to be falling away, this probably wouldn't work so well because we have some polygons that are getting left behind, and thus they might not fall, they might not get activated, and then the dynamics won't take over. So that doesn't work right away. So instead of random, why don't we change this to noise? So our random mode is now noise. By default, it's really tiny. If we hit play, it's not going to look super different from what we just had. But we can grab our scale and make it way bigger. Let's do 1,000. So we've got a way bigger number there. We hit play, and now look at that. We're going to start seeing an interesting pattern emerge. And there's definitely some variation in it overall. Now, some points are being left behind. couple things we should keep in mind. If this random noise, and you can visualize it. In fact, if we zoom up, we can actually see a little preview of it, of the kind of the overall scale of the noise. But if this is super red, then this dot, the radius being generated, is too small for a point to jump to the next one. So right here is particularly dark, and none of those are getting activated. So we want them to get activated. We don't want anything left behind, but we do want this overall variation. So what are some ways we can control that? Well, one way is maybe add in some animation speed. Let's go and add some animation speed of, let's say, 55%. And what's happening now is that noise will be animating. So even if one point isn't getting any power, eventually it'll animate away and then get some power applied to it. Now, that's not necessarily perfect, but is a technique that might allow you to, to make it so that none are getting left behind. Having said that, you can end up with some problems, especially here at the end of the animation. You can see we get this little island here. So this might be a chunk floating in the middle of nowhere, not connected to the rest of it. So there's some limitations here. We could speed this up, but the faster we animate this, the more likely we're not really seeing those random patterns around. It's going to be hard for anything to be left behind, but now there's less variation. There's some variation, but there might be less. So instead of we're using the animation speed, let's get rid of that and let's look at the remapping of the noise. That's a little trickier to visualize this, but keep in mind there's two ways to think of this. We have a noise which is outputting somewhere between 0 and 100%. We can also just picture kind of the basic Cinema 4D noise, which is black to white. So white is 100%, black is 0. So if we say we already know that our distance is 3 times the amount, we are 3 times the minimum. So that means if we take the minimum amount here and say 33%, in fact, let's do 33.3 just to be sure. That is a third. And we're saying you have to apply at least a third of the power to it, which means every point should be spreading out. Just some of them will be spreading out less than the others. We have a minimum now. So if we hit play, then now we should see it spread out with no animation, but you can see no points are being left behind. So that's interesting. That's pretty cool. It's being mapped on, and we have a lot of control over that. Now, there's not quite as much variation as I would like to see here, but we have so many more controls that we can tinker with. And especially this concept of everything is getting something applied to it. Let's push that a little bit further. So, like I said, we're being really meticulous with this, but this idea of controlling this vertex map could be applied to so many different things on fields. I feel like it's worth spending the extra time talking about this. If we go back to our vertex map, and we go back to our freeze, and we go back to our layer, we've got our radius. Now remember, this is just the original number times 3. So I'm going to say times 2, so we're double that amount. So we're times 6 of the original number. So that means we have even more growth potentially happening, which means we can minimize some of the growth if we go back to our random field. So here, instead of it being 33.3, we could divide that in 2, or if we want to be super precise, we can go back to 1, or we can go to 100%, which is the max, divided by 6. So now we have 16.6 repeating for the minimum. So now everything is getting applied a little bit, but some of these other ones could be getting way more, a way bigger radius applied. So the growth should be pretty quick right now overall. But now what we can do is start remapping this a little bit. So if we twirl down this contour, we can change our mode from none to something like curve. And now with this curve, you can see we get a little bit of an arc to it. What we can say is most of the time we want a pretty minimal amount to be applied. And if we grab our handles here and really stretch them out, this is saying, you know what, don't apply more than the minimum, but at the edges you could get a whole bunch of extra growth going. We want to be careful about going too far with this. But if we hit play now, hopefully we can see a lot of variation, but nothing ever really gets left behind. Something that's an interesting byproduct here is that some of them seem to be able to jump a little island ahead. Let me see if I can see one. Right there. You can see this jumped ahead a little bit because the noise allowed it to go here and then spread there, and then that was a very strong patch, so it's growing. But these are partially applied as well, so that I think that's probably okay. And now we're getting a really interesting overall growth pattern, lots of noise variation, and very precise control. We're not just clicking numbers. We know why it's behaving this way, which means we can manipulate it and change it in different ways that allow us to artistically control it. So by going back to the main field tab of our random field, we could do things like try different noises. We can try, unfortunately there's no preview here. We don't get that nice little drop down to see them. But purlin noise is like the old school noise. We can change this to, let's do something that stands out. Let's try dent or chronal. I think it's Cronulla, might be, who knows how these are pronounced. But let's go ahead and try that one. This should be a completely different pattern. In fact, the way this one seems to map out is it's just going back to the diamond pattern, so it's pretty minimal overall. So that one might not be great. We could do something weird like Luca, and some of these might not look great at their current scale. Although this one, yeah, this one's really going out there and giving us a lot of randomness. Increasing the overall scale could be a good idea depending on them. But when it comes to artistically controlling these, I actually think sticking with the very basic purlin noise is a good way to go. There's already so much variation there that pushing it much beyond that makes it just so it gets hard to visualize. But we still have a lot of control over maybe grabbing the overall scale. I can double the scale that's being applied here, and that might give us some different patterning here. Definitely we need to see some more time. Let's go and triple our timeline. 333 should be about right. Now let's get the growth. It's a little bit diamond in the beginning, but then it spreads out. And look at these really nice patterns that begin to emerge overall. We could give it some overall animation speed, would be good. We can also go back to our original freeze and increase the effect strength. So if it's going a little slow, we can increase the effect strength. It should be the exact same thing, just faster. So that is now a speed control for us, how this pattern is spreading out. Maybe splitting the difference there. Let's do 15. Let that spread out a little bit. I like that. And then I'm going to go back to the random field. Maybe this noise is a little big now. Let's drop it down to split the difference. So we got 1500 there. Let that grow. I like that. And keep in mind that now we're visually seeing this very nicely, but you can always go and click on different random seeds. So we've got our default value here, but let's go ahead and go up one random seed and see if we like the look of that one. And I actually do like that one quite a bit. Let's go and just drag it to some random number. And you can just go through, try a couple of them. Ooh, that one spread out horizontally really nicely before it started spreading out further. You know, all that, you know, it just works well. This is pretty cool. I'm quite pleased with that overall. So it just gives you artistic control of these spreading out in slightly more interesting ways. And you even keep in mind, like I'm giving it this minimal amount, so it can't quite spread there. But that was just one option. I could drag that down to 0, and now we're going to get very hopeful. Well, okay, interestingly, the first point is not a valid point. It can't grow at all. So I'd have to do a different random seed in order to kickstart this. So that one didn't work. This one worked. So just a different random seed, and now it can spread out there. With no minimum, it can't quite get there. But we could give it some animation speed. Let's say 55. And now as that animation is animating, slowly different parts are going to get the option to spread out. And it'll stop for a little while. But then as it's animating, other parts should start activating. It took a little while, but now more parts are going. So, you know, the faster we increase the speed, then the more likely we are to see different chunks start reactivating again. And you can see now we're getting these very distinct angles spreading out. So you can see just by tweaking these numbers, we can start getting dramatically different effects as it is moving around. I like that's pretty cool. And going back to the remapping, you know, we can give this a minimum, and we don't need the minimum to be the actual minimum, but it is going to pull the entire arc up. So I didn't quite get to that minimum. It's not being forced to go to that minimal amount, but I did pull that bottom line up a little bit. And keep in mind, this min is visually kind of equivalent of pulling that up a little bit. Not quite, but they're almost exactly the same. So by putting that minimum, we are now adding in all this extra blur and it's able to spread out. Some points are getting left behind, but it's such a more distinct growth pattern. So well, once again, like I said, we're going to spend a little extra. We spent a little bit of extra time on that because understanding the way that behaves is going to unlock so many possibilities for you using fields. So having done that, let's go ahead and maybe chill this out a little bit. I'm going to pull the minimum back here. We'll allow a little bit more overall growth to happen. And let's hit play. And let's see. Okay, very nice, distinct growth. There is one chunk there being left behind. I would like to avoid that. You know, the original way of avoiding that, of course, was doing divided by 6 on 100%. So now it should be pretty difficult for a big thing to be left behind for a long time. Having done that, I guess we could make this a little bit more peaked like that. And keep in mind that we do have the animation speed going right now as well. But you know what? That's pretty nice looking growth. I am pretty pleased with that. So let us move on to the next step from there. Let's save our scene file. And here we go. So immediately, the simplest way to see this as far as our existing rig would be let's hide our ground reference. Let's reactivate our Voronoi Fracture. Hopefully it's still broken. Luckily it is. This is still got that same vertex map in there, so it's already driving it. So if we hit play, we should just see the new growth pattern that we just generated coming from that, and we see it getting translated instantly to that object. So we just have that little bit of extra control from there. So that is working automatically really nicely. For our setup, we do not want to be running our dynamics on the Voronoi Fracture. We want to be running some dynamics on the plane. So let's go ahead and delete the dynamics tag. We don't need the MoGraph selection tag anymore. Let's go and hold down controller command and turn off the Voronoi Fracture. And let's go ahead and make a duplicate of our ground reference and unhide it. We don't need its vertex tag. We don't need its copy of the random field, but now we have the same poly count exactly the same way. Let's go ahead and rename it to ground dynamics. So this is supposed to be a dynamic. So let's go ahead and right click and add a simulation soft body. So we've added a soft body selection there. And if we go ahead to object mode here and we hit play, then what should we see? Well, we're going to see gravity take over, and it's just going to start falling through our viewport because gravity's taken over and it's just falling. We don't want that type of gravity. We want it only to be applied where our vertex map is, and we can't do that through the global gravity. So let's turn that off. Let's go to Command and Control D. Go to Dynamics, let's go to the General tab, and under Gravity, let's knock that down to 0, no effect. So now if we rewind and hit play, then nothing should happen. It's just sitting there statically. So we need this to now move somehow. It's going to move via a simulate particle wind. We probably could use gravity as well, but I like using wind because we could potentially change the orientation if we need to. So we've got a wind. I want that to point downwards. So I'm going to hit R for rotate. Let's spin that holding down shift to a -90, so it should be pointing perfectly downward. And because everything is applied by default automatically, we should be able to just rewind, hit play, and see the entire thing start slowly moving downward, pretty much just like gravity. The only difference being is it's not quite as strong. So this wind force is being applied because this is a soft body on every single individual point on our dynamics. But they're going to have a really strong relationship with each other. And we can see that if we create our wind. Let's grab our wind, and in the wind we have an object tab, but we have a fall off tab, which then gives us access to fields. So now we have the fields, we can go ahead and drag in our vertex map growth. So with that in there, if we click on it, you can see it's automatically constantly trying to find the nearest point. So with that in mind, if we hit play, let's see, hopefully the wind is only going to be blowing on those middle points as this slowly grows. And if we hit play, well, it's hard to see anything. Not much seems to be happening. And why is that? Why doesn't it seem to be moving down? Well, there's a relationship between all the different points on this plane. There are springs due to the soft body where they're trying to stay connected to each other. And then the springs are telling it, don't stretch, don't bend too much. And that is preventing this from moving. What we want is pretty much no relationship between the individual points. So what we can do is go into our dynamics tag. And first of all, we can turn off in the collision tab, turn off self collisions. We're not worried about it colliding with itself. That should just speed it up a little bit overall. And then we can go into our soft body tab, and you can see that we have a bunch of settings here. So here's structural springs. That's what's telling it to maintain the length. We don't want any of that. Put that to 0. No damping either, just so it's not calculating it. We have shear, no damping. Flexion, no damping. That's trying to stop it from bending in certain ways. So now there's no relationship anymore between any of the points. So let's see what happens when we hit play now. Oh, look at that. Now all of them are starting to move downward immediately. We're getting a really interesting weird breakup pattern here as the entire thing falls apart. But if we rewind and hit play, that should be a little bit cleaner. I just didn't rewind all the way. Dangerous to make changes, not at the time of 0. So now that I rewound and hit play, now you can see this is perfectly blowing straight downward the parts that we told should be affected via directly this vertex map. It is now deforming it, but in a very cool, dynamic, automatic way. So that's working well. Why don't we give this a quick save? So why don't we move on to the way that the wind is being applied to the dynamics. Right now the wind it's constantly trying to find the nearest possible point, and it's constantly applying that power again and again and again, which is cool, but I don't want these pieces to very slowly get applied the power, because oftentimes, we'll see here, we're going to have to unhide the ground plane, select the vertex map, hide the ground plane so we can actually see it. You're going to see that, and I want to hide this random field, so let's make that invisible. So you can see that as this slowly spreads out, that the wind is going to be applying here only a little, probably 16%, because that was what the 1/6 of the amount worked out as. And I don't want 1/16% of the wind. If gravity is affecting it, gravity should be affecting it. So what I want to do is control this in a more clamped way. Now we could do this directly in the wind, but I want to do it in a more visual way. So what we're going to do is make a duplicate of our vertex map growth. So we got a brand new one. I'm going to delete everything from inside of it, and let's rename it immediately to vertex map wind. So this is the vertex map for the wind. And what I want to do is, how should this be controlled? What fields should drive it? Well, what I want to drive it is the other vertex map. Let's go ahead and drag that in. And in the vertex map, it's automatically trying to find the nearest one. I'm going to set it to index, so it should just be, the nearest would work, but index just is like, hey, whatever the same point is, I want to be the same. So now you can see that if I hit play, this new vertex map is doing whatever the first vertex map is doing. But it is independent. We can change this and do additional things with it. We could add additional noises, additional growths, all sorts of weird things. But we're going to do something pretty straightforward. What I want to do is make sure that this doesn't have this fade off. I want it to be either 100% or 0%. And the best way, the quickest way I've found to do that is to go and create a quantize. So under this modifier layers, we can create a quantize. And now it's doing 4 steps, but if we drag that all the way down to 1, you can now see that this is either 100% or 0, and you get that soft fall off between the two, but it's 100% or 0% applied. Full contrast on there. And you'll see if we click back on our original one, it's still there. It's not affected at all. We click on this one, and we can see it fully modified. So that's cool. It's a very non-destructive workflow. And along those lines, let's say we wanted to have this push in a little bit or outward a little bit, depending on if we wanted to kind of have a preference for the brighter 100% or the darker 0%. So what we can do is create something like the curve modifier, and we can affect this middle point. Now we're not going to see it unless we move it below the quantize, and I want to visually see it. So let's turn off the quantize for a second. Right now it's not doing anything because it's a nice flat curve, but if I hold down controller command as I click in the middle, I'll get a new curve. If I pull this up or down, you're going to see we're going to have kind of a preference for one side or the other. So with that in mind, if we turn on the quantize again, as I raise up the curve up and down, we're going to shrink it or we're going to enlarge it. So we can be like, okay, not until it's 100% and more towards the middle is it applied. And I think that's what I want to do. So with that done, now if I rewind and hit play, we can see this growth happen, and it's just going to kind of pop into existence. But now the wind can reference this one. And so the wind will blow down as that grows out. Awesome, exactly what I want. So let's go ahead and let's hide our ground reference, unhide our ground dynamics, go back to our wind. Let's rewind to the time of 0 if we're making changes. And let's drag our new vertex map. Well, you can see we're on wind, we're on fall off, and there's our vertex map growth. Let's replace it with the current one, and I can just drag it and drop it exactly on top, and it will just replace it. So now when we hit play, we're going to see that the wind should be getting applied fully, never partially, fully on that, and it should start falling away a little bit more consistently and a little bit cleaner. But I think now we're going to start seeing the emergence of something really cool, and that is as these pieces fall, we're getting some curvature on it. You can see there's a little bit of curve on this surface. So when we now apply our Voronoi fracture chunks to it, it will follow that direction, and that's what we're going to do now. Let's go ahead and give ourselves a quick save and move on to that part. So how are we going to actually apply our Voronoi fracture chunks to the geometry here? Well, let's just do this step by step. Let's reactivate our fracture here and go ahead, and we're going to create a new cloner. Let's make a brand new cloner. And what is this cloner going to do? Well, I want to clone a series of planes. Let's make the planes 1 by 1, and we're going to make it pretty tiny, so I'll do 10 by 10. So nice and small. I'm going to make a child of the cloner, and let's go ahead and tell the cloner to clone onto an object. And what object is it going to be? Well, it's going to be the Voronoi Fracture. So now we've done that, it's cloning them randomly onto the surface, but I don't want that. I want them to clone onto the axis. So now I should clone them 1 per axis. I think in R19 we started being able to clone onto an axis, which is very useful. We've also got align clone. I'm going to turn that off. I don't care about aligning to the clone. Let's visually hide the fracture object here, and you can see that we've now got a whole series of these all over the place being cloned just in space. And they should all be flat and they're all on the ground. So that's actually working pretty well. Now, with that happening, what I want to do, let's go ahead and group this. I'm going to hit Alt-G to put that into a null. Let's move that down below our ground dynamics plane. And let's go ahead and put our cloner into a connect object. I'm going to hold down Alt-Option as I'm selecting the menu here, and let's make a connect, and that should automatically turn into a parent. I can get rid of weld because we don't need it doing the calculation to try and weld the points together. But what that's doing is telling Cinema to kind of think of this cloner as just a single polygon object. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and create a Cinema 4D mesh deformer. This mesh deformer, we're going to put as a child of the null, so a sibling of the connect object. And what we can do here is drag our ground dynamics into the cage setting. And then we want to make sure we twirl down our advanced setting here. And where it says external, it's set to ignore. We want that to be surface. Some of our nice little polygons here are going to be a little bit above or a little bit below the surface here. You see some are floating lower, some are floating higher. We want them all to be attached to this. And if this was set to ignore, then I don't think anything would stick to it. Now, I had no idea that the mesh deformer could actually work on, without a volume. I always thought it had to be a volume that worked, but this actually opens up a lot of really cool possibilities. So with all that in place, with surface turned on, we should be able to go ahead and click initialize. It's going to automatically create a display tag and a compositing tag so that this won't render anymore. And we still see in the viewport without it taking up too much space. But with any luck, if we rewind and hit play and let this wind go, we're going to now see those individual polygons being deformed perfectly along the surface. But not only are they being deformed along the surface, but you can see they're actually tilting properly over, so they are leaning over. Now, some will stretch and face slightly different angles. That's completely fine. That's not going to affect anything. But that is working really well. So now we have a different polygon per position all over the place relative to this plane. So now we need to somehow transfer this back to our fracture object. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new MoGraph matrix object. Let's go ahead and move that below the null and all the new stuff we just made. It's going to be below that. And we're going to set that to object mode. And the object is going to be the connect object. And we're going to change it from surface to polygon center. So what should be happening now is it is creating a single matrix object on top of every single clone everywhere. And so we have the exact number, but it's now transferred into a matrix object. And it's being transferred into the matrix object, which, by the way, we should probably name some of these. Let's go ahead and name this matrix transfer. And let's go ahead and just rename this one mesh deformer, so we can tell what those are doing. So now we've got our matrix transfer. So how are we going to transfer this? By selecting our Voronoi fracture and creating a MoGraph effector, inheritance effector. Let's go ahead and click on that one. It should be automatically applied because we had selected. I like doing the order of operations, so let's move this below the matrix. And what is it supposed to follow? Well, it's supposed to follow wherever our matrix object goes. So let's go ahead and say, yes, follow the matrix. Let's go ahead and unhide that also. So go ahead and follow the matrix. Now, it's not going to do anything by itself until we turn on morph motion object, the little bool checkbox here. Let's turn that on, and boom, instantly we're going to see a big reaction overall. And that is because it is not doing the correct orientation, and everything's facing the wrong rotation. But we can fix this really easily by going back to our matrix object, and here we can go to the transform tab, and we can change our rotation until it matches. Now, I haven't gotten perfect consistency here, so really it's just going through and finding the correct combination of 90-degree rotations that is going to get it where you need it. So for me, rotating P to 90 degrees seems like a good idea. And then B is not doing anything, so let's try rotating that one. Nope, that one's not working either. I've actually had this happen. So what I'm going to try and do is -90, -90, -90. Okay, that seems to be working pretty well. Yeah, okay, it's kind of a tricky combination. Once again, I don't know if there's a good mathematical combination here, but the correct collection of 90-degree rotations will give you the correct orientation back again. So -90, 90, negative 90 seems to work here. I'm not entirely sure what drives that, and I feel like I've gotten different numbers on various different tests, but it's always going to be some sort of negative 90, positive 90 combination, and eventually you find the right one. And now that that has happened, I hope we should be able to rewind and hit play, and let's see. Oh, look at that. Now we have our individual chunks going and rotating and falling down with our overall object. And look at them peeling perfectly down. And I love this kind of curvature that we get as they peel down and away to follow this mesh. So that is working really well. And that it's that orientation that I think creates a lot of possibilities here. Let's go ahead and rewind and do some tweaks before we go any further. Let's turn off the Voronoi Fracture, and let's do a couple extra tweaks on our dynamics. I think I want these to fall down faster. So right now our wind speed is just set to 5. Let's go ahead and, I'm not sure what number we want. Let's jump it to 25 and hit play. And let's keep in mind our playback speed here, so we can't entirely trust it. That's falling away quicker, but still not that fast. I'm going to double it again. Let's jump it up to 55. And let that play. And now those are falling away quite quickly now. Keep in mind it's about the third of the speed that they eventually will be. But I think that should help a decent amount, just making that a little bit faster. And if we were inclined, I had done things in the past where I would make another instance of the ground dynamics and make it conform in the exact same way and run a smooth deformer on top of that to smooth out the deformation. But I don't think that's necessary depending on what your final effect is going to be. So we're able to very quickly make any changes we want to the way that grows or how fast the wind blows. And as soon as this mesh starts deforming down, it's just going to update and our fracture object will automatically be stuck on the surface there perfectly. Let's go ahead and turn that back on again. And let's just frame forward once so we can actually see it refresh. And now we can see our mesh moving downward. I'm going to get rid of this display tag because I want that to be solid. We now see the mesh underneath, and in some ways I kind of like seeing that mesh underneath where we can see our objects peel downward and start rolling down with it. We have this stretching ground, and in some of my tests it looked pretty cool when you actually see the ground there instead of it just being empty. So we're going to keep that around for sure. But let's begin getting into some of the fancier things involving getting some cracks to show up here on our fracture object before the pieces actually fall away. So let's give this a quick save and think about the next thing that we want to do. I think we want to start getting some variation in the way this is breaking apart, a little bit of anticipation. Let's start like making these chunks like move up and down a little bit, maybe get some cracks forming ahead of time. So let's start out with it cracking ahead of time. First, I think let's grab our fracture object and let's not colorize our fragments anymore. We'll hide that, and let's hide our display mode as well. I'm gonna hit NA so we can hide the lines rather, and now those go away. So it should look nice and flat overall. And let's go ahead and try and deform this. How are we gonna do that? Well, let's hit Alt-G and group our fracture object here, and let's go ahead and even rename that fracture. That should be useful. And we're going to deform this, but we're going to deform it with a MoGraph plane effector. Now make sure you don't have any MoGraph objects currently selected, and now I'm going to make a plane effector. Instead of using it as an effector, let's use it as a deformer. This is going to be very similar to the displace deformer, but it actually calculates a little bit quicker, so we'll use it this way. So with our plane deformer, it's currently set to Y100. So let's go to deformer, and we've got deformation. I'm going to say I want it to deform the polygon. So it should grab the normal of the polygon and push it. But it's pushing it currently on Y. Now, I can never remember which orientation we actually want this to be. So I usually just guess and check. It seems like Y is really powerful, so I'll set that down to 5. It's like, okay, well, that's interesting. That's neat. But let's go ahead and turn on SSAO so we can actually see any cracks in there. But it doesn't really seem like that's the orientation. So we could try X, but I'm pretty sure it's Z. So let's try typing in on Z. And okay, well, something definitely happened on Z. It seems to be pushing up and down all over the place. So let's go ahead and check out our edges. Yeah, NB, the shortcut again. And now it looks like, oh, look, it seems to have inflated on all of them. So Z seems to be the correct orientation. Let's put it on negative Z. So -5. There we go. Look at that. Now all of them look like they are shrinking inward a little bit. And that is pretty nice, actually. That's pretty far. That's a little extreme. I'm going to drop it down to -2. And let's hit NA, and now we can actually see all these cracks emerging ahead. Well, everywhere. These are just being applied everywhere. It's saying, hey, just apply all over the place. So, okay, that's a good start there, but we don't want it to be applied everywhere. We only want this to be in some places. So what we can do is jump to our fall off, and I'm going to drag in to our fall off inside the plane effector. Let's drag in our original growth vertex map. And we're going to see just a little crack right here in the beginning. Let's go ahead and hit play and let this play through. It should still be pretty quick. One of our points of building this is that we can still kind of work with it in our viewport. And now we can see that we are getting some cracks being formed just a little bit ahead of our overall setup. That is pretty cool. Before they move, we can see a crack emerging. So let's go to the plane effector. I'm going to rename it plane deform, just so we can remember what that one's doing. And with it deforming on that direction, I think I want it to be spread out a little bit more. And you know what? Maybe we can even make it a little more powerful. So I'm going to say -3, 4. Okay, -4 seems pretty good. So slightly bigger cracks. Now, the coolest part of this is that the cracks are thick and then they slowly get thinner as it moves away. So I really like the way those are going to get revealed. As this grows, the cracks will spread. So it's not just like we shrunk a chunk down, because then it would be uniformly scaled around. But instead, it's kind of getting bigger as it gets further away. Let's say we want these cracks to be spreading way further than they currently are. How would we do that? Well, I think the best way to do it is for us to visualize it with another vertex map. Let's go ahead and hide our fracture. And let's rewind all the way. And let's go to unhide our ground reference and I guess hide our ground dynamics. So we're going to be, like I said, we're going to be doing that a couple times. We need to see the object that we're working with. So now we can click on the original tag, and of course this is going to grow just like it always does. But we want a version of this where it's bigger. So we could make a copy of it and like change the way the freezing is working and change the way the fall offs work. That'd be really tricky, because then those are independent variables that we'd want to be similar, but not quite. So a better way to do this is let's copy the vertex tag entirely, and we'll delete everything that's inside of it, and we'll rename it, but we'll just rename this one blur. So what do we want to actually drive this field? Well, we want the original vertex map again, vertex map growth, but if we click on the tag, currently the mode is set to nearest, but there's a really, really powerful mode in there, which is average. And what average is going to do is check everything within the radius and calculate the number that way. What this effectively leads to, for our purposes, is a blur. This is now whatever this one looks like, but very blurred. So we can put different numbers, different radiuses. We can do a radius of 200, and now it's way more blurred. But as this spreads out, it's going to be a very blurred version. So let that play a little bit more. It's a very blurred version of whatever this one is doing. So once again, what's powerful about this is this is dependent on whatever this one is doing. So if we update the way this one grows, this one will automatically update and blur to catch up with it. That is amazing. Now, it is actually pretty difficult to blur vertex map within itself, but if you make a copy of it and then you feed it itself, you feed it the original one, blurring it this way it just works perfectly, and it's incredibly powerful. So now based off of that, let's go ahead and unhide our fracture, go back to our plane deform, and replace our growth vertex map with our blur vertex map, and boom, look, we get more cracks spreading out even further down along the line. So now, where this can get even more interesting is we could manipulate this vertex map further with like different curves, but we can actually do that directly inside of the plane deformer. Now we'll have to use our imagination a little bit, but we can use those exact same ideas. If I, inside of the plane deform, if we create a curve, this curve is going to be changing the way that this is applied, and you can imagine it on the vertex map. But we're going to use that vertex map in multiple places, so let's go ahead and just manipulate it here. So if I were to grab this top point and drag it to the left, it's going to be making it more powerful, and you can see it's making the cracks be a lot more blatant and a lot more spread out. If we grab the bottom one, it's going to weaken it. It's going to be remapping it and pulling the strength further in. So if we just wanted the cracks to be just barely on the outside there, we could do that. Or we can pull it in and then make it more powerful as they come out. And along those lines, we could push it in like that. And we can even manipulate it with these curves if we want to. I could level this out a little bit and really taper them in, or we could have them exist a decent amount right away. And you can see how much I could spread that out. So yeah, just by changing this curve, we've got complete control over the way these cracks are going to be spreading on the object. Now, personally, I think that looks pretty good, but there's a good chance we're going to be coming back and changing that a little bit more later on. And that is because our next step is going to be adding in some extra randomness. So let's go ahead and give this a save as number 10. And let's look at adding some additional effectors. I'm going to turn off our plane deformer. It's doing a good job. But let's select our actual fracture object here, and let's add a MoGraph random effector. So it's going to be randomly pushing everything all over the place. We don't want that. Let's go ahead and say, I don't want any random X, no random Z. A little bit of random Y might be nice, though, but not that much. Let's try 10. So yeah, you can see, we can even interactively pull this up and down. We can push this up and down and see, okay, like getting a couple extra fun chunks up and down. My thought here is, let's go ahead and make it pretty crazy right as they're about to fall. Like we'll add in, they anticipate their fall by like jittering a little bit, but it's going to be a little bit more artistically controlled instead of the randomness the original dynamics were giving us. So I kind of like the way this looks. It's never going to get that crazy on the outside. It's only going to happen kind of right on the edge. So that's looking pretty good. But let's go ahead and also turn on rotation. And we got to be careful here. If we go too far, we're going to get some blatant early intersections. And we are already getting intersections, but I just don't want to push it too far. Don't want to make it obvious. And then, yeah, some nice rotation there. So there we go. Look at all this really nice breakup. Now, we don't want this applying everywhere, obviously. So let's go to our fall off, and let's drag in that same blur. Now, we're not looking at the deformer at all. We're only looking at this random. Now, let's go ahead and pull the random in, and even rename this random rot and pause for random rotation and position. I just like designating my effectors for exactly what they're doing. And now we can see it's really bending these all apart. But in the same way that we manipulated the way our fall off was working inside of the deformer version, let's go into here, and we've got our blur, which is mapping to the nearest, which is working well. But let's go ahead and add a curve onto this and remap this one. I think this I want to be pretty strongly affected. So I'm going to raise up that power, but I'm going to weaken the fall off. I only want this to kind of be happening right near the edge. So you can see this is the entirety of this effect. It's just randomly doing some ups and downs and rotation on these chunks before they fall. And based on this, we can go back to our parameter. I could say give it some more Y height, so it's randomly pushing up and down more. So with that happening, we can then well, let's just hit play and see if this gives us anything interesting. So yeah, you can see these little cracks form and pop up, and we get this random motion traveling a little bit before it then decides to fall. I like that. But you can take that, and now we combine this really blatant movement up and down by turning on our deformer, and now we get the additional cracks forming both on those objects and beyond. So now we can go back into our deformer and push that further, just like we were talking about. I can grab the strength and start pulling it out more, and now those cracks get more blatant, but they're not too far away. And we could curve these up a little bit, make that pretty strong. There we go. So now we get a lot of variation right on the edge, and the cracks forming a little bit further away. And let's hide our ground mesh and reveal our ground dynamics so we can see the plane as it falls. And now when I rewind all the way, actually, I'm seeing one more thing we should deal with. If you see that we actually have some cracks here right in the beginning. Why do we have cracks at the very start? We're all the way at the time of 0. Well, the reason we have that is let's unhide our ground reference again. Doing that a lot. Turn off hide our fracture, hide our deformer, mesh deformer, and let's reveal our ground reference and go to the original vertex map. And you're going to see that at frame 0, there's a dot. There's some yellow, which means it then gets blurred. And even though it's going to be really hard to see, there's a slight, like it's being applied slightly, maybe 10%, maybe 5%, but very faintly there. And that's giving us a little bit of a crack in the beginning. So go back to our original tag, and this is being generated because this spherical field is being fed onto that point. So I think if we were to just hit, like there's a lot of ways we could animate the strength of, where is it, the spherical field. Also, let's move the spherical field as a child of the ground reference because it's only affecting that tag. So let's move it near its relationship there. And along those lines, if we're just organizing things, let's grab our wind and move it down. I'm going to move it below the ground dynamics. I don't want it to be a child. But anyway, back to our spherical field. If I grab this and I move it up into the air, hopefully it's going to pull away from the point and turn off. But you'll see that it doesn't. And this goes back to, and I'm kind of glad this happened, this goes back to something I said earlier, which is our freeze deformer can be a little bit weird or temperamental. Maybe I'm not using it correctly, but on the freeze, it seems to be remembering that the spherical field used to be there. And I don't want that. I want it to only add on after the fact. So I'm going to hit clear. And when I hit clear, you see that now it seems to have disappeared. And I'm not sure. I'm going to click freeze. Maybe that will lock it in that this is the way it's supposed to start. I don't know for a fact that works that way, but I know hitting clear fixes it. The point here being is our spherical field now isn't being applied and then is being applied. Isn't, is. And now along those lines, we could also animate it via the strength slider. So we could grab the strength, the remapping strength up and down. So why don't we say at the time of 0, it's going to be strength 0. And then let's go 5 frames forward. Yeah, 5. And then at frame 5, we're going to have it go up to 100. So it's going to kind of transition in that little bit in the beginning. So hopefully we can rewind here and hit play, and now you can see it slowly fade up and start growing. So it starts out with nothing, which means now we can hide our ground reference. We can reveal our ground dynamic plane, and let's reveal our fracture. And then we can zoom out, and now, yeah, now you can see, look, the crack does not exist on the ground in the beginning. It should render completely flat, and we should be able to hit play. And now we can see the cracks begin to form. The pieces randomly move up and down to get some little jostling in there, and then they begin curving downward and falling into the pit. So we've got 2 different layers of extra fun revealing here that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And man, that's really cool. I love the way that these are falling down. Now, there's a couple additional things I'd love to add in here. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to visually hide the wind. We don't need to see that in the viewport. Now, as these pieces are falling, they're sort of embedded in the ground here. They're passing through the ground here. So why don't we make it so those get pushed forward a little bit? And actually, before we do that, let's give it another quick save. Number 11. So with these piercing the ground, how would we stop that from happening? Well, they're going to start out passing through the ground there. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But what I would want to do is have them, as they start falling through the ground, they can start pushing inward a little bit. So let's go ahead to our original fracture and let's put another plane effector in there. So I had a plane effector in, and you can see the plane effector is already actually by default doing exactly what we want. It's pushing it outward on Y, and it's relative to the node. So as this piece falls down, it's pushing out on Y. Now, it's also pushing up currently on Y. So we just need this to not be applied all the time. We need this to slowly be applied as it falls into this hole. So let's go ahead and add into the fall off. We're just going to make a simple linear field fall off. And I'm going to set this linear field to be, I always mix these up, but I'm going to say Y plus. And now I'm going to pull it down. And okay, I got it backwards, not surprising. I say Y minus. Okay, now you can see, especially because they're turning purple, that as they go further down, they're getting this applied more and more. So why don't we zoom out a little bit here, and let's make this, I don't know, 3 times as tall? We're not going to see too much of the hole. And I'm going to visually I'm just going to eyeball this. I'm going to pull it downward. And now, yeah, right there, as it starts passing through, and I can even pull this off the side so we can see it better. See, we get this nice little fall off here. So as it's falling down that little bit, it's going to be transitioning into whatever we feed it. And currently we're feeding it through to be being affected by the Y position, and we're also affecting the color. So I can turn the color off, and now they won't be purple anymore. So yeah, now we just want them to move on Y. So let's go ahead back to, I'm clicking my middle mouse button, by the way, in the viewport. If you middle mouse button, it'll go to all 4 views, and then you can middle mouse button and go to whichever one you are framed over. But now, as these fall in, I can grab my plane, and we can go to the parameter, and I can increase my Y here. And as I increase the Y, you're going to see that they're going to push away from the surface a little bit, just to have them kind of tumble and be independent. So let's go ahead and rename this plane effector away from wall, just to be really literal with it. And I'm going to put it above the random position and rotation. In fact, this should be random position rotation at edge. And then So they're falling down that way. If we wanted to push this even further just for fun, we can do a very similar thing, which is going to be, let's copy, or we've got the fracture selected again. Let's make another deformer. So I'm going to make a random deformer. And we can just say, well, do we want random? We could do random. Yeah, I guess random's fine. I'm going to pull it way down here. I want this to calculate after the away from wall. So I'm going to put it visually below, not a sibling. Now that's not actually having any effect, like where I position it here, but I like it being in the same order here that it is if you click on your fracture object. So in effectors, you can see we've got that same order. So I'm going to go ahead to our random, and I'm going to say, I guess this one is just going to be random rotation. So this is going to do the same kind of fall off, but to a random rotation. So I don't want to affect the position, but I do want it to affect the rotation. And I'm going to put it 90, 90, 90, and those, by the nature of a random effector, they could be positive or negative. Currently they're applying everywhere, of course, but I'm going to go into its fall off and apply that exact same linear field. So that linear field is applied to both the random, well, it's applied to both the plane away from wall and the random rotation. I'm just going to name it in pit. So which is, it's just descriptive of what it is, even though these should probably correlate with each other a little bit more. But now they're falling away. Now, they might start passing through each other down there. Once they get to a certain point, I don't really care. I mean, I don't think I'm going to be viewing this from an angle other than this. But keep in mind, these are each independent controls. You don't need to actually do any of these individual steps if you don't want to. But now the hope is, let's go ahead and hit rewind. You can see perfectly flat. Hit play. And now the cracks start to form. The first pieces are going to start falling in. You get that nice randomness happening, which is kind of artistically able to be controlled because we can do it with our plane. We can change the way they're being affected. And now as they fall into the hole, they're going to get more and more of that randomness applied, and they'll randomly rotate to a new position. So they don't, you see right there, that's twisting really nicely. And they'll push away from the wall. So that's what we just added in via those. So I think that's kind of a neat addition to what we were doing there. And I still really love the way that these are bending to fall into the pit. Let's give it a save. Something I think I'd like to see here is smoothing out our ground dynamics a little bit. Now I'm a little worried about that because dynamics can definitely behave a little strangely depending on, if you put a subdivision surface on a dynamics object like that, it can definitely freak out. So you might do that as a post effect, like with subsurface sub-poly displacement might be the way to go on that one. So honestly, I think the last thing that I would like to do here is something that's a little destructive to the setup that we have here. So this would sort of be a last step when you're very happy with the way the rest of it's going. There's probably some other ways you could do it with via noises. We're going to have to do this a little bit destructively, and that is I want some very strong cracks that are going to spread out from the center that we can see very clearly, and they're going to be way ahead of the rest of it. And I only want a handful of those, and I want them to be very, very specific. So in order to do that, we're going to have to make this editable. And bring it back and be parametric. But the splines that we generate will not be parametric. So that's why I'm putting this at the very end here. So let's go ahead and actually, what, even before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the procedural nature of this. If I hit NB, you can see we can go back to this original shape. And we have all these different chunks and all these different subdivisions on it, and they're being merged in some really interesting ways. Well, we built this really, really clean and really, really parametrically. So what we should be able to do is make changes all over the place and increase resolution or make it more detailed or less detailed, whatever we want to do. So as one example here, let's go ahead and add a whole bunch more chunks here. Not necessarily more pieces, not more clusters, but more initial sources for our distribution so that more chunks are generated so that this ends up being more detailed and then potentially more realistic. So the way we would do that would be jump into our fracture, and in the fracture we're going to go to our point distribution. Let's go ahead and add in more points. Let's jump really high and go to like 9,999. So this is like 4 times the amount here, and you're going to see it's going to generate a whole bunch more. Now you're going to see a problem right away. Like this doesn't look right. It looks completely messed up. But that's okay. We haven't broken it yet. It just looks broken. But what I want to point out before we go any further is that these individual chunks have gotten more detailed. There's a lot more breaking apart on the edges. And the further we push this, the more detailed those will look. So let's push it even further. I'm going to add a 1 in front of that, which is going to essentially double the number there. It's going to take longer to calculate. And it's running through and it's trying to update all of them, and then it's trying to reblend them together to be additional chunks, and it went super crazy there, and it put them all into the middle. I'm going to go and turn off our inheritance right here. So let's turn off inheritance, and it should jump them all to the original spot. But you can now see that each of these individual chunks we got here is so much more detailed, all this extra detail. And depending on the way you're breaking apart the ground, that could be a positive thing. This might be a really nice pattern for you to work from. So let's just say that you did want to work from this more detailed pattern. The way you would do it is, you saw I updated our fracture object by adding more points, and I turned off our inheritance. The main problem here, let's visually hide the fracture. The main problem here is that our cloner, this is now generating a lot more, well, actually not more points, but different points in different spots. So they don't know where to go anymore. So what we would need to do is turn off our mesh deformer for a moment and make sure that, yeah, this should have automatically updated to whatever the new fracture was. So this is the new positions, but that means we need to go to our mesh deformer and just reinitialize it. So I just have to go here and say initialize, and then it's going to put those in new positions. And now that those are in new positions, the matrix should have automatically updated. So now it's automatically on there, and now we can turn our inheritance back on again. And with any luck, as soon as that gets applied and we unhide our fracture, you can now see that the inheritance is turned on and they are in their correct new position. So all you have to do is go to your mesh deformer at the time of 0 and then reinitialize, and there you got brand new chunks. If you change the seed, if you change the count, anything, that should update it. And that's going to run a lot slower because the chunks are a lot more detailed. But I should be able to just hit play here and everything should update. You can see let me go ahead and hit, I'm going to pause it, hit NA, so we see this flat part, and now you can see just this more detailed clustering. Look at these nice cracks getting spread out all over the place. Everything updated, and now this new system is working where the other one, in place of what the other one was. And of course, at the same time, we can go ahead and rewind. If we want to do fast test here, let's turn off our Voronoi Fracture, holding down Control to turn off both of them, and we can always at any point go back to our original ground reference. Let's unhide that and hide our ground dynamics, and we can select our original dynamics tag, and we can change the way that this is spreading out. So this is our current growth pattern, and we're not getting real-time feedback here just from all the different setups that we have, especially these dynamics running. That's probably the main thing stopping us. If we went to our ground dynamics here and I temporarily turn that off so those aren't running anymore, then now hopefully we're going to be getting really good feedback for the way this is spreading. So that's for me that's running about 30 frames a second, and you can see we get this really nice growth going. But if we were like, you know what, and this is real time now, effectively real time. So this is how fast the pit's actually going to be growing and expanding. And actually that looks pretty good to me. But let's say you want it to be slower, you just slow down this effect strength. If you want it to be faster, you could increase your radius, you can increase your effect strength. There's a lot of different variables, but we could just change that. And once that's done, we would just reinitialize everything, make sure that our dynamics are turned on, and then turn everything back on again, and it would just start working. So it's really cool the way we can update and combine all these. And that is how parametric this overall setup is. For now, I'm going to return on our fracture object. In fact, I don't want it to be this big crazy number. So I'm going to go ahead and let it do this initial calculation. Unfortunately, I shouldn't have turned it on until I changed these numbers. But right now it's calculating. It'll eventually finish. In fact, I might be able to turn it off here. So now that it is, the fracture's there. I click on sources, go back to reasonable to do to, and then turn it on, and it should pop it up almost immediately. And they're in the wrong position because we need to go back to our mesh deformer, which everything should have filtered through and updated, and I can say initialize, and now that reinitializes. In fact, let me turn off inheritance. I think we have to turn off inheritance first and then say mesh deformer initialize, and then we can turn our inheritance back on again, and now everything is proper again. If we hit play, then these should be able to deform downward again, and we get everything back just the way we had it. So looking good. Excellent. Quite pleased with that. So now let's move on to getting those final cracks that I was talking about. Let's save the scene file, rewind all the way first, save as number 13, and let's get these cracks designed. What I'm going to do is, we've got our fracture object here. I'm going to say make it editable. I'm just going to make it editable, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to hit undo until it reappears. Cool. So now I've got on my clipboard a copy of this made editable. Let's go to a new file. I'm going to paste it. And now you can see that I've got all these different separate fragments, which is fine. One of the problems is we have all of these tags. And I think that's one of the reasons it runs slow, is that so many tags are being generated. In Cinema 4D, every time you make a selection tag, depending on how many different things are selected in it, it could take as long as an entire object to calculate. So all these tags are dramatically slowing us down. So let's go ahead and select every single one of those tags, hold down Shift, grab them all, delete, didn't need any of them. And now everything has been collapsed down to just the polygon objects, which means I should be able to, let's make a connect object actually. It should be pretty simple. I'm gonna make a connect. Let's go ahead and make these all a child of the connect. And it's going to be welding, so it's going to take a second for it to do the initializing there. But I'm going to go ahead and select connect and then make it editable. And there we go. It's been turned into a single object here, but it does have all of this volume and there's lots of extra polygons in there. So here's what I want to do. I only want to select all these topmost polygons. What's the best way to do that? Well, this is pretty straightforward actually. Let's go ahead and select everything. And I want to make this way taller. I'm going to make it, instead of 50 tall, and we're in polygon mode, and select it all, which would be Command or Control A. Let's go ahead and go to our Y size. I'm going to say I want to jump it up to 500, so it's way taller. That gives us way more resolution. In fact, let's jump up to 5,000. So it's way taller. I can hit the letter S. We're going to zoom out, and you can see I've got all this resolution vertically. So if I go to a side view here and also hit the letter S, what I want to do is do a rectangle selection on the points, and right now it's set to not worry about visible and not worry about tolerance, which is exactly what I want. So I'm going to do is do a big old selection all the way up to the top, but not quite the tippy top. So I'm going to do that and hit delete. And then let's hit the letter S for zoom up. And now you can see that I deleted every single point except for this top layer. As far as I can tell, it's hard to tell perfectly. I'm going to select all. And yes, by hitting Command A, you see my Y is 0, so there's 0 height. So that means I left only of the topmost polygons. If you had more, then you could just zoom up more and select more of the little polygons that were hiding below it, or the points that were hiding below it. But now if I go and look at it up here, you can now see that we've got all of our individual polygons, and it's just one flat layer. I see I end up with one hole here, which is interesting. I'm going to go ahead and just hit MD, close polygon hole, and close that. Make sure you close any that you see. You might not actually need to do that, but there we go. And then in addition to that, why don't we go ahead and select all of our polygons here. And I'm going to put them on Y position 0. So now they're going to be zoomed way down to the original position of 0, 0, 0. And now we can start making our selections really easily. And it looks like we even had a couple other holes here. Honestly, I don't care. Those are fine. What we're going to do to do selections is pretty straightforward. I hit UL, which is a loop selection. And we've got all these crazy patterns. Now what I want to do is just do a couple of selections, but I want to stop at boundary edges. So I do that, and now it doesn't make double lines. Now we don't have too many qualifications here, except that we know that our cracks are going to spread out from the center. So from right around the center is where we want these all to originate. So I'm just going to make a couple of selections here. Let's see if I can get a couple nice ones. I want a few more. Oh, that one's nice. I gotta be careful to make sure I get a good selection. If you don't very carefully click on the line, it won't actually add it. And then I could even go further here. I want to be really careful. Yeah, I would like to do a secondary little one here where it kind of branches off twice. But you can see here that most of these are really blatant. Actually, that one's not bad. I'm gonna click there. And I'm going to erase out some of them. So I'm going to go to my live selection tool, and I can just be like, nope, don't select any of those. So I'm erasing out other ones. But you got to be careful because look at that little one. And that's because on my current selection cursor here, we are only selecting visible elements, and the way this is overlaying on the other ones, it doesn't see it. So let's go ahead and turn off select visible elements, and now I can more carefully be sure I'm erasing them out properly. And if you click your middle mouse button as a button and I drag left and right, I can make this bigger or smaller. So by making it a little bit bigger, I can go and erase some of these extra little selections I didn't quite want. So you see I got that extra bit of line there. So that's looking pretty good. But you can also hit the shortcut UM, which is path selection. So UM. And what that allows you to do is click and start drawing out an additional path. So if I select here, I could start manually tracing out a new path for this to travel. So that's just a little extra crack there. We can grab this one and pull it in a little bit. Now the one note I want to throw out here is we want everything to kind of continually go outward radially. Because if I had a crack that goes out and then curves back in again, as our overall effect grows outward, it's going to catch up to, let's say I made this crack, or if I had a selection like that, it's going to grow from the center and eventually just reach that. So we're kind of doing a little bit of an illusion here, just making sure it's growing out from the center point before it gets to those cracks. But I think it works pretty well. So, I could make a few more of these very carefully if I wanted to, but I think that is looking pretty good. I am quite pleased with that. Maybe one more little one there. This can be a little finicky because of all the extra little subdivisions, but that is looking awesome. So now we got that. All I have to do is type in Shift-C and then type in the word edge. So Shift-C is going to pop up the command manager, and then I can type in the word edge, and now we can find our edge to spline. So now I've got that. It has now created a spline, and of everything we just did, this is all we care about. We've now got this edge spline. So with that edge spline, we can copy it, and let's go back into our, and we could save the scene file if we wanted to, in case we needed to come back to it. So let's go ahead and do that. I go to 13, I'm gonna make it 13B, and we'll just call it spline gen. So we can always come back here and modify the spline. Now the important part here, now that we've copied the spline, is that this spline is perfectly going to match the path of our overall chunks here. So let's go ahead and paste it. Now we're not going to see it visually in the viewport because it is at 0, 0, 0. And if you remember, our chunk here is 50 in height. It's 50 units tall. So that means half of it's above 0, which means we now have to take our spline and jump it up above the ground 25. But if I actually want to see it, I'm going to type in 26, which is fine. I'm going to type in 26 and boom, there's our spline. If I hit NB, then, well, it's going to be a little hard to tell, but there we go. You can see our spline is perfectly following along the line. Awesome. So now this should be pretty straightforward to add this effect in as well. I'm going to hit NA again to hide those. And now, how do we want this to deform? Well, you know what? I probably want it to be inside this plane deform. I think that's going to be the best way for these cracks to get revealed. So inside of the plane deform, we can add on an additional effect. So we can go into our fall off, and we're going to add on something on top of this one. So what I'm thinking is we need to make another version of the blur, maybe a bigger one, or we might be able to use the existing one, because this one we cropped in and this curve made it quite bright. So I'm worried that this blur isn't going to be quite big enough, but let's go ahead and do this step by step. So those are existing ones. I'm going to turn them off temporarily. We're not even worried about them. And let's go ahead and drag in our edge spline. Let's drag that in by itself. And let's see what the edge spline is doing for us. Well, it's kind of weird. What are we seeing here exactly? It's a little strange. And that's because by default, the splines, when they're brought in, are set to spline shape curve, and the distance mode is along. But we don't want the distance mode to be along. We want it to be the radius. So this is now looking at the radius. It's trying to generate a radius off of the spline, and then based on that, it's going to be applying it to other spots. So let's go ahead and visually hide that spline. And now let's just look at the end result of it. So that seems to be working pretty well. But let's go ahead into our deformer again, and let's increase our radius a bit. And as I increase my radius, there we go, look at that. As I increase the radius is now big enough to actually get to those subdivisions. And you can now see these cracks very blatantly formed traveling along. So that is great. That's exactly what we want. We want these cracks to be formed. But we don't want them to be just there in the beginning. We want them to grow ahead of the rest of our animation. So what we need to do is also apply our VertexMap blur. So let's go ahead and apply that as well. So now that is there. It's covering it up. It's completely overriding it. But if I tell it to multiply on top of it, it's only going to show up where the two are, where you can both see the vertex map and see the spline. Now, nothing's there right now, but if I hit play, then there should start being some growth, and with any luck, we should start seeing the cracks form ahead. But the problem right now is that, well, we're seeing the cracks form, but it's really subtle right now. So just like we did before, we need a curve. In fact, why don't we copy this curve, because it's already kind of doing what we want. I'm going to hold down Command or Control. It's going to make a duplication of, oops, let me actually make sure I'm grabbing it. It's going to make a duplicate. Oh, maybe if it's turned off, you can't copy it. Huh, okay, well, I think I found a tiny bug right there. If it's turned off, you can't copy it. But anyway, now I've got this curve. I'm going to put this above our spline. And what this should hopefully do is make it so that the spline, or no, I'm sorry, it's not, we gotta be careful here. Let's go step by step. I want this to affect our vertex map blur. I want to push it further. But if I put this above, it's going to be affecting all of them. So now we get to do something a little bit more advanced. We get to make a folder. So this is just like Photoshop. If I put the blur and the curve into a folder, and I can put the vertex map blur back to normal, then now you can see that we are making, so this curve is saying like, hey, radius, become bigger and more powerful. So you can see it's getting spread out more. And now with that being spread out more, that is what the VertexMap blur is doing, and now that gets multiplied on top of the crack. So now you can see those cracks start to form ahead, but right now we're seeing the limitation of what we're doing here, and that is that this VertexMap blur is not blurred enough to get ahead of us. It's not quite powerful enough to show us the effect even further. So a couple things we could do. If we wanted to be very, very explicit with it, we could go up here and make another duplicate of it and make it blurrier from that position. But we also have the option, if we're feeling confident in what we're seeing, we don't need to make it explicit. We can do it here. We already dragged a VertexMap blur in. We, instead of using range nearest, we could say range average again. And now we could start blurring it more from here. So now you see as I increase my blur, it's starting to travel further and further ahead. And we didn't need to make another vertex map. Most of what we could have done from the original one. I just want to make it really explicit, and you can make it as clean as you want to. So now I can just be confident that this is referring to the original blur, and now I'm blurring it even more, and it's going even further. So I could keep on pushing this further and further by adding more and more blur, and then we could always grab this curve, and the sharper we make that, the more we push it further, the more that's going to grow as well. So yeah, now we got these cracks that are traveling way ahead of everything else. So okay, that's actually working really well. I'm quite pleased with those cracks that are forming further ahead. So we could probably name this folder main cracks. And then what we want is to see these smaller ones as well. So we want to see both. So what we could do is probably, well, let's see, what's a nice clean way of doing it? I'd probably make another folder and have this folder contain both the, I gotta be careful because I accidentally put it inside this folder. So I'm gonna pull it out of the folder and move this above the folder. So your final structure here would be this folder containing the curve and the VertexMap blur, and that's self-contained. It's multiplying on top of that. And now those are both put into a folder, and we can have that have, I'm gonna hide them for a moment. We can have that have some effect on this one. So this one is there. So what I think is we want to see this one, but we don't want this one to be quite as strong. So what I'm going to do is make a solid. And this solid, I'm going to put right above it. And this solid is going, you know what, just for visual sake, it's not going to change anything, but I'm going to turn these checkboxes off. So now we got a solid. And the solid is just like a solid color or like a 0 to 100%. I'm going to set this to normal. It's just completely normal. It's fully there. So you can see it's applying all the cracks everywhere. But I'm going to drag this value down to 0. And now it's saying, hey, no cracks anywhere. But now I'm going to drop this to 50%. And if we want to be precise, we can. We can also just go to blending and type in 50%. And now you can see the cracks are there, but they're 50%. They're a little bit fainter than they used to be. And now we can make our secondary level of cracks, these ones up on top. Let's make sure we turn them all on. And I can even collapse the folder down and then rename this one cracks. Or, you know, once again, main cracks. So now I can say I want that to screen on top of it or add. So either of those are valid. I'm going to say screen. And now you can see that we get our big cracks and then the small ones underneath. Now I want to make this a little bit more blatant. So why don't we make the overall plane deformer stronger? And grab the plane deformer and let's say that it's pushing really far. I'm going to say -10, which is probably too much. But then you see these cracks are really big. But now with those bigger outer cracks being so strong, we can go back into the fall off and I can start moving this solid further and further up, thus telling these inner ones to just have a little bit of the effect. But then these further out ones, these big cracks, those should be really blatant. These cracks are going to really spread out ahead of the rest of it. And then we get, so there we go. Actually, now we get the big cracks that are traveling further ahead of our overall effect. We get these nice smaller cracks that are a little bit ahead of the overall falling effect. And then right before they fall in, there's getting a whole bunch of random push up and down, a little bit of rotation as well, before they actually fall down into the pit. And all of that being, you know, most of these cracks being done just by a single plane deformer, which is pretty cool. I'm quite pleased with that. So let's go ahead and rewind and give this another save. Number 14. And what I think I'd like to do now is do a quick render, even just a hardware render, to see exactly what we have in real time, and then make some adjustments based on that. So let's do that. Let's go ahead to our render settings. Command or Control B will pop open your render settings. I'm going to go ahead and say Hardware OpenGL. Let's click on that tab, turn on Enhanced OpenGL. I'm going to turn on our SSAO so that we can just see We can see the little bit of shadow there. And actually, just based on that, we can zoom out a little bit, and then let's make sure that we are outputting all frames. And we'll probably run out of RAM because it doesn't keep too much. But you know what? That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and, once again, hit a quick save there. And let's send that to the picture viewer. And I'm not saving. And I'll go to the picture viewer, and now it should go frame by frame, and we should see the cracks start getting revealed. You see those initial cracks are going to like shoot out really quickly because it's taking the initial tiny blur and doing a big giant blur. And that is pretty much exactly what we told that to do. Also, visually in the viewport, I can stop this because you can see I didn't turn off the proper plane here. So we want to make sure our ground reference is not going to show up in the viewport or in the render. Our ground dynamics is going to show up in the viewport and the render. And that is fine. Now, technically we won't see this, but our mesh deformer, that one, it shouldn't render. And honestly, we don't need to, well, leaving it in the viewport is fine. We have our matrix transfer. We don't need to see that in the viewport, but once again, it's fine. We can grab our inheritance. That's actually the first thing calculated, so I'm going to put it on the top of the fracture breakdown here. And you know what, this edge spline can live anywhere, but I'm going to put it down here, maybe... I'm going to put it next to the deform. We can make it a child, but it's fine living right next to it just for a little more organized. Once again, another quick save, and let's hit render, and let's see what we get immediately from here. We get really good feedback. I mean, this is going to play through this pretty quickly. Now, it's not real time, which would be amazing. If we had fewer, fewer selections, fewer chunks, then it might work a little bit better. This is still showing the display mode, so I'm actually going to delete this little eyeball. I don't want that to show the mesh, the wireframe. I want it to just be the final mesh. And actually, now I think about it, this compositing tag isn't going to stop it from rendering at all if I actually hit the real render button, so I'll delete that. But for now, this is fine. Now let's go ahead and kind of take a look at this. We can already see that these cracks are indeed staying ahead of it. They're going way out in front. We can see our, the smaller cracks are going. We can see that they're start bending up and rotating downward, and then we see our pieces begin to fall. That's looking really good. Like I said in the RAM preview, it quickly runs out of RAM here when you're doing a hardware render especially. But yeah, look at these fall through. That's looking really nice. So I just want to see, let me see how the pace of this feels. Yeah, those falling down feel pretty good. So yeah, that's looking great actually. I don't need that to render any further. I've got all the information I need. If we want to, we can rewind and hit the little preview button here. It's going to cache all the first frames to RAM, so we can play those back at least in real time. And the beginning part here I think is the most informative. So we can see this actually playing back in real time. This is actually what we are generating. And we can see our pieces go and flop over there. They're rotating down. That looks really good. I can even see right now that there's almost a little bit of harshness here as they tip over. There's a little bit of they start rotating down and they stop. And then let me see. Yeah, that's that's working well. Let's just look at each aspect. Like, how do the cracks feel? I really like those cracks. They appear really quickly in the beginning. So potentially we could keyframe the blur in the beginning up a little bit more. Remember that very last average blur that we put? We could keyframe that if we want to. I don't think it bothers me that these cracks are revealing themselves very quickly, and then they keep on spreading. The way it's falling down is looking really nice. Honestly, the only thing I feel like I would like to do here is maybe add on a little bit of a delay. So I'm going to let's get rid of that, and we've got our fracture object, and all I'm going to do is add a MoGraph delay effector, and that's going to be the last thing to calculate. And I grabbed the wrong object. Very careful. Move the delay down. And the delay, we usually add on like a spring or something, but right now we have it set to blend. And so with a bit of blending and a decent amount, I'm going to turn it up pretty high. It's just going to smooth it out as it bends from one side to another. Now, if I want it to, I don't know if I actually want this to affect everything else. I kind of like the idea of these crack, like when these, when the position on the edge suddenly pops up as a crack. I don't want that to be delayed. So you know what I'm actually going to do? I'm going to move this up here below the inheritance. So first the inheritance happens and then the delay. Now it's actually not doing it. It's just representing it. So let's click on the actual fracture object, go into our effectors, and make sure that inheritance happens first and then the delay. So this delay has no effect on these ones that come after, and that is definitely what I want. So that should just smooth that out a little bit. Let's go ahead and check out those first few frames again because it's so quick to render. Let's see what that does for us. These cracks get revealed very nicely. And the hope here is that these are going to start tipping down a little bit more smoothly, and then they're going to fade in their final position a little bit more. Those early ones are passing through each other a little bit more than I'd want. But once again, you can just choose different random seeds and get ones that don't intersect with each other. Potentially, you know, there is that original dynamic method we were talking about. And like I said, everything that we've done here, forming these cracks, you could have done it on the original methodology. You could have done it on the original MoGraph selection and done blurred MoGraph selections and then all of these exact same things on that rig and thus make it truly dynamic instead of this ground plane sort of dynamic. But I really love the way these fall in. Now, in some of my early tests, and I didn't save any of them, but in my early tests, what would happen if these were true dynamics is I'm going to stop this. Like this part would suddenly like leap into the air and go flying into the pit or go shooting up in the air and land on the rest of it. It just wasn't consistent, which is why I started exploring this additional methodology. So let's go ahead and cache these first few frames and see what we're getting. Like we definitely get these popping up, and let's see if they feel like they're tilting into position a little bit more. Yeah, they do. Yeah, look how much more smoothly. It's really hard to tell, but if you look at any chunk, it's more smoothly doing this tilt in. But yeah, just look at the way that just looks. It just looks so cool. And any given frame, I'm not like my eye is not catching that those are starting to intersect with each other. You just get that really nice pop, and then they start tilting inward. So this is, I mean, at least for my eye, if you're doing something a little stylized, like is this super realistic? Probably not. But for my eye, this is more artistic, and it's got this really nice controlled flow, and artistically we had the ability to make these cracks go anywhere they want, as fast as we wanted to. There's so many additional layers. It's just such a fun, powerful technique. At this point, like that's the meat of this. I am going to go a little bit further on things, and we're going to add on some extra little rocks. And I think we'll probably even set up a Redshift render in the end. But if you're not interested in that part, then we've definitely wrapped this up. But let's go ahead and give this a save, because that is looking pretty great. I'm quite pleased with it. And let's go ahead and add in just some extra random chunks on here. So we're going to do this in a very, very simple way. What I think I want to do is let's just hide our entire fracture because we don't need that. And my thought is what if we make just a random shape? I'm going to make a platonic. Why not? That's a weird shape. And we're going to make it pretty big. And the bigger it is, the more chunks we're going to end up with. And I can move it up in the air a little bit. And let's go ahead and make a fracture. We got another fracture, and let's drop that in. Let's go ahead and name this one Fracture Extra Chunks. And all I want to do on this one is go to sources, and let's go ahead and create a whole bunch of additional pieces. So I'm going to type in 1,000, about 1,000 here, so you get all these extra chunks. It's pretty big, and I don't want to make too many of them, so you know what? I might actually shrink this object. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink it until those pieces are a little bit smaller. And there we go. And now we can go and clone those. Like these are individual chunks if we wanted to get this detailed. We can just go ahead and clone these onto our original ground dynamics, which would be the most simple way. The most simple thing we could do is just make like one little random rock and then clone it a million times onto it. But I thought this might be neat to reiterate the inheritance thing. So we know that this has exactly 1,111. So what we could do is create a new MoGraph matrix object. And let's just call this one extra chunks. And I'm going to tell this to clone onto an object. And the object is going to be the ground dynamics. And on the ground dynamics, I'm going to say I want exactly 1,111 of them. So now let's go and hide the other transfer, the matrix transfer. And now this is what it's done. It's gone and spread out all these little chunks. That's exactly how many we have. I can go ahead and click on different random seeds if I want different distributions. There we go. That's fine. And now all I have to do is grab our extra chunks here, make a MoGraph effector, inheritance effector, and I'm going to go ahead and tell it to directly transfer to wherever these matrix objects are, and have a morph motion object. Turn that on, and boom, every chunk from that one shape has now jumped onto the surface of the rest of our object. Matrix objects take a little bit of time to calculate, but not too much, so we get it almost for free. And you see in the viewport that we've just got all these extra chunks all over the place. So, and making more or less of those is as straightforward as taking this matrix object and saying, I want twice as many of those, and then I want twice as many chunks. And then it's going to be cutting all those pretty much in half, and now we've got the exact count again, and there we go. Now there's more chunks laying around on the ground. And those are just stuck there, so even without, I'm going to turn off our fracture object. I'm going to turn that off, hold down Control, and now if I hit play, as our dynamics are applied and these start falling in, those will just follow automatically. We get that for free. So these are just extra chunks to help fill in that overall void to make it look like there's extra little pieces in there. You can make as many or as few of those as you want to. So that is neat as well. We can just go and turn that back on again, unhide our fracture, and yeah, if we were to hit play here, it's going to be relatively slow in the viewport, but you know, we're still getting some sort of feedback in here. And dare I say it, a lot faster than if these were actually running full dynamics. And we can see these start tilting over, and we can see the nice little individual hidden ones underneath, and those will just be falling with it very nicely. So I am quite pleased with that. Yeah, those will just fall in all the way. So let's go ahead and save this file one last time as number 16. The next chunk of this tutorial, I'm going to be moving into the world of trying to make this look a little bit prettier. Not my area of expertise, and we're going to be using a bunch of plugins to help that along. We did the meat of the tutorial. The focus of this was supposed to be the dynamics. But I'm going to move forward. I'm going to use some Gorilla Cam to get a little camera shake, and we're going to be using other plugins like the Everyday Material Collection and probably a little bit of maybe some HDRI link to get some quick lighting in here, just some extra details to make it look nice quickly, because that's not the focus of this tutorial. So if you don't want to continue into that and you don't want to be doing any Redshift because you don't have Redshift, maybe you're an Octane person, then this is kind of the meaty part of the tutorial and we can cut it off here. So if you're done now, if you are not planning on continuing until the last part of this tutorial, I would really appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe if you really liked this stuff. And if you really, really like what I'm doing, then you can head over to a Patreon and give me some support over there. It enables me to make more of these tutorials and do more live streams. And you can get access to scene files and bonus live streams. And you know, it's just a lot of fun and we do extra stuff. So I appreciate that. Hey, Chris from the future here. There is going to be a small section at the end where I spend some time talking about how to limit the simulation to be within kind of more of a circle within this overall square, so the dynamics don't go all the way to the edge, and it makes it so you can maybe insert this a little bit more easily into something else. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that. All right, let's get into a little bit of rendering here. Let's go ahead and go to Redshift, and I'm going to create a Redshift dome light. And I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to add a plugin from Grayscale Gorilla that I helped develop called HDRI Link. And we're going to control the dome map by dropping it onto Link. And now we can double click it and pop open the browser. And I'm going to go to the 4K skies because I don't need the crazy resolution. And let's just pick a nice bright sky, but not too bright. And I like the more noontime ones a little bit. Let's grab that one. I like it. Number 72, and now we've got that light, you know, this nice HDR into that image. So with that in mind, now this should be getting illuminated, and now I'm also going to use the Everyday Material Collection that Chad put together as a way of jumping into just grabbing a couple base materials that we can then build from. So I think we want some concrete. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a nice dark concrete, and let's grab a nice, let's make these thumbnails bigger. Let's make a, ooh, I like that one. Let's grab this one. It looks pretty rough. Is there any darker one that looks really rough? It takes a second for Redshift to acknowledge those getting loaded in. Let's go ahead and see. No, I'm pleased with that. Actually, I'm going to grab this one instead. So I'm going to put that and replace the dark one with it. All right. So let's go ahead and apply these. So it should be pretty straightforward. We can go and apply the surface level kind of concrete to the overall Voronoi fracture. And I'm going to apply the secondary one, which I want to be the interior. And we can apply it more specifically by exposing our selection tag. So I'm going to go to our fracture object. Let's go to the selections tab. And I'm going to say I want to see the inside faces. And now I'm going to limit the second material to be the inside faces. So yeah, that becomes the inner part. So let's go ahead and I'm actually going to hit play. Let's go a few frames in so we can actually see a difference between the two. So let's let this calculate. It shouldn't take too long. Also, something to note would probably be a good idea is if we bake our dynamics, then we should be able to scrub the timeline. I mean, it's not going to scrub quickly, but we would be able to we would be able to jump to any point in the timeline and it would update. So anyway, I just wanted to get a little bit further in so we can see these cracks a little bit better. And now let's go ahead and pop open this material, double clicking. I hit edit shader graph. And this is supposed to be the internal material. And I just want it, I like that texture, but I want it to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to search for a color. Actually, I'm going to search for the word correct. And there we go, color correct. And now you can see here's our diffuse color. And I'm going to feed that into this color correct. And just to do it quickly, all I'm going to do is start lowering our gamma down a little bit. You can see right there in our preview that, there we go, it gets a little bit darker. And that's what I'm kind of go. I don't go too far, just a little bit darker. Nice. So having built in, okay, now we put in our dome light. We got two basic materials. We can go ahead and apply this material additionally to our extra chunks. So we'll put that in there, and that should apply overall. And yeah, I'm happy with that. Let's go ahead and turn on our Redshift. Well, let's go to our render settings actually. I'm going to say I want to render out, let's make a new render setting. And let's call this one Redshift. By the way, I am not an expert in Redshift, so if I do something wrong here, feel free to leave a comment. But I'm going to go ahead and go to Redshift, and clicking on that, we can turn on some GI here. I'm going to say brute force. Brute force, 3 bounces is probably fine. I'm going to go to 2, and then we could go to our basic tab, and we can jump these up a bit, jump this up to like 64, maybe 16. Don't want to go too far. We're just doing some quick tests here. And I think that's all I need to do right away. Let's go ahead and pop open our Redshift render view and just hit play. And let's see if it's giving us anything reasonable. Let's see how that looks. Oh, okay, not bad. I like this super scratchy concrete. That's neat up there. And then I think that our darker material is appearing down there, but I want to make sure. So let's go ahead and make it cartoonishly dark. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this color correction open again, and let's go ahead and lower that way down. And let's, yeah, there, okay, you see it, indeed, that is the interior. I just wanted to make sure that it was. Maybe I'll split the difference a little bit, make it a little bit darker so we can blatantly tell the inside from the outside. And yeah, that's looking pretty nice. Now, we do have all of these really harsh edges. So most of our effort here is going to be doing the displacement, which takes a couple of steps. Before I do that, though, I do want to grab one more material. We got so many windows here. I want to grab one more material. Let's go to the browser, hop up one, and I want to grab another Redshift one. I just don't know where it is. I'm going to try organics. Yeah, here. So he's got, Chad made a ground 1 and a ground 2. Let's just go ahead and grab ground. And I'm going to go ahead and make it so that our ground reference is going to, actually our ground dynamics is going to have a material. Hopefully here we'll see it appear right away. There we go. We get this nice dirt. So our overall scene is pretty big. So I'm going to make these a lot smaller. I'm going to grab that and say tile 3 times, 3U and 3V. Just a couple more extra tiles there. And honestly, our overall concrete here, let's go ahead and zoom out. Let's see how that looks. You know what? Actually, it's not bad. It's a little, perhaps a little zoomed in. It's so specific, I feel like it might tile. But let's go ahead and tile that 2 and 2. So it's twice as many. If it's really, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit obvious that we're seeing a pattern here. I can see that chunk and that chunk. But if we added a little variation or displacement or even rotating it a little bit, then it would hide it. But to tell you the truth, the way that one looked, I kind of liked it at 1.1. So that's fine. And you know, honestly, we could probably go do something like 1.5 just to make it a little bit more. I don't think we'll see the patterning too much there, yeah. So that's working well. Let's go ahead and save this and then move onward to the displacement. Now, this is definitely something I'm still learning about, but we're going to go into this concrete for our displacement. And let's just, even right now, I'm just going to rename it real simple. I'm going to call it displace air. And let's go ahead and edit our shader graph. And we're going to do a couple things. This material is spitting out, you know, this diffuse color, which is fine. But what I want to see is the wireframe. I'm going to search for the word wire, pull out wireframe. I'm going to say output wireframe into the diffuse color. Excellent. So that means in our Redshift or render view, it should mean, I hit run on here, we should now see a wireframe there. You can see we are seeing exactly our polygons. So we're going to want to displace this somehow. And we're going to displace it by adding on a tag. So let's go to our fracture object, which is what's actually displacing. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say I want a Redshift object tag. And inside of there, I'm going to go into geometry and I'm going to say I want to override the geometry. And let's go ahead and enable it. And it's instantly going to create a whole bunch of subdivisions. And boom, you can see right away, look at all these extra subdivisions. And putting in this wireframe really helps being able to see how it's subdividing. But you're also going to see that's going to be rounding everything out. So these look more like smooth stones that were, coming out of the ocean or something. Don't want that. So the best way to stop that is turn off smooth subdivision. So get rid of that, and now it's going to subdivide everything, but not try and curve it and smooth it out. There's going to be one slight problem, though, and that's if I move my camera into a spot that has no cracks whatsoever, we're going to see that there is still a little bit of implied crack in there. And we're going to have to do a little trick to get rid of it because I was not able to find any easy way of getting rid of it. I even went through and did tests where I was trying to limit this material to only be, I mean, even right now, this material is limited to this inside faces selection tag, but it's still not preventing it. I did a whole bunch of tricks. I couldn't figure out any specifically better way. So hopefully the trick I show you makes you happy. But if you know of a better way, please leave a comment. I would super appreciate it. So let's get some displacement going. I do tend to have a little bit of trouble getting the scale working properly here. So what I'm going to do is make a noise. So we've got a Redshift noise. Unfortunately, they don't have Cinema 4D noises yet. I hope they do in the future. I'm going to put this into the color channel so we can kind of blatantly see it, see that pattern right there. And the reason I want to do it that way is I want to see if the pattern's showing up and how much contrast there is. So we can go into the noise and go to our coordinates and do things like shrink our coordinates. If we want the pattern, I'm going to shrink these, which hopefully will make the pattern shrink as well. So give that a second. Actually, is it the opposite? I think it might be the opposite. I have to make it, it's one of those ones where you have to go bigger instead of going smaller. So I'm going to go jump it up to like 7. And I think we're going to see a more distinct type of noise. Yeah, there we go. You can see that the pattern emerging a little bit more. So let's try 11, 11, 11. Let's see if the pattern emerges a little bit even more. Yeah, there we go. You can see the pattern beginning to emerge. So, okay, that's the right scale. We were able to see that via our diffuse color. Now I'm going to put the wireframe back in again. And now, inside of our output node, I'm going to click and I'm going to say I want some displacement. So we're going to output some displacement. And in order to get that, we need to translate our noise into some sort of height map. So let's go ahead and make I'm going to search for the word, I think we search for the word bump. No, do we search for displace? Yeah, displacement. So I'm going to grab a displacement, and I'm going to feed this noise in as the texture. That's going to be the texture map. And then we're going to output that, and this has some sort of height associated with it. You can see we now have a height of 1. Excellent. So height of 1 is great. That noise is outputting. I like that. Now we need to go into our Redshift object tag, and we have a displacement checkbox. Let's go ahead and turn that on, and hopefully we're going to see something happen. Let's see visually. Yeah, boom. Something happens. Pretty subtle. It's not too crazy yet. Something important that I definitely found is I want to turn off bump mapping for a moment, and I don't want to see it bump mapping. I just want to see how the displacement is working. In fact, I'm going to zoom up a little bit more onto the area we're seeing the displacement a little better. There we go. I don't have very good intuitions here, but this is your maximum displacement and displacement scale. So I think even if we made this number pretty big, let's jump that up to 11. I don't think we're going to see much of a difference here as far as displacement is concerned, because our displacement is not allowing it to go beyond that. We have a maximum displacement. So if I jump that up to 11, let's see if we see something. Yeah, now that we've increased that, now you see it's actually pushing further out. So that automatically becomes we are now successfully seeing that displacement, which is cool. But all of our displacement, I think, is pushing outward. We have a height field and the space is object, but right now it's outputting, and this is really great. We can twirl down in the displacement. We are currently going from 0 to 1, which is what the noise is. It's white and black, 0 to 1. But if we go to our displacement, I can say, you know what, I actually want to go from -1 to +1. So that means you can pull in as well as push out. So there we go. As soon as I do that, now we see we're getting some pretty nice looking displacement. Another thing, if you haven't tinkered around with Redshift, is we have the way it's subdividing, and the way it subdivides is very different from the way the rest of Cinema 4D subdivides. And that is when you're setting your maximum length, I don't know if it's pixels, but it's saying how far can it travel kind of in the viewport before it needs to do another subdivision. So we're saying 4 units. And then this is a clamp on the top, like don't subdivide more than 6 times. So what would happen is the further back in space that we go, the less it's going to subdivide. But what's the best way of explaining it? If we let this break a little bit more, let's stop it from rendering for a moment, and let's let this continue breaking some more. We want a pretty wide divide here. I'll let this go further still. That piece is really popping up through there, but once again, I could do a random seed on something or have the growth be a little bit different. Or, in this case, I just not quite have my camera being there, but that's a little bit further here. Let's go ahead and turn this back on again, and let's see if we can see the effect. The hope is we're going to see some in the very foreground. You can see right here, we got all these little subdivisions, and you can see in the distance that look how many tiny subdivisions are, but in the distance, there's a lot less subdivisions. But I think the overall height of these is not super dissimilar from those. So it's the further away it is, the less detail it needs, and then it subdivides it less. So making this maximum edge length smaller is how you make more subdivisions. And then this maximum subdivisions is how many times it can be subdivided again. Keep in mind, every time it goes up 1 subdivision, it's 4 times as many polygons. And that's about what I know there. So now that we've done that, I can go ahead and enable our bump mapping again. And that means it's going to add in even more detail. But it does such a good job with bump mapping that sometimes I couldn't tell if my displacement was working or not. Actually, the bump mapping is a little harsh right there. It's pretty powerful. It's probably because we made our scale so big, but I really like these individual chunks. I might pull our overall scale back. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, you know what? I kind of didn't like the auto bump mapping, so we're just going to turn that off. And we're going to let the displacement do the talking here. And now it's a little subtle, so we're going to put that back up to 11. Excellent. And now the hope is everywhere that we have these polygons, we can now see that our edges have all these nice imperfections all along, especially when we see them up close. So that's just, it looks so cool when you do that. So now that we know that those are working pretty well, let's not use the wireframe, but go back to using our color. And now we can bring that darker color back in again. That should pop in, and this should refresh in a moment. It's pretty dark because we kept making it darker, but with all of these little imperfections, I'm pretty sure we can go ahead and brighten that back up a little bit. Let's see how that looks. Yep, I like that. And yeah, excellent. So now we need to do one last trick with our vertex map. Let's go ahead and pause that, and that was going well, so let's do another quick save. So like I said, the best method I found to hide these cracks that we don't want to see is kind of faking it, but in a pretty neat way. But we might need to make another vertex map to be able to help us here. So in order to do that, why don't we go ahead and hide our vertex map temporarily, our fracture right now actually. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, leaving it a little bit further in this timeline is fine, but I want to go ahead and unhide our ground reference. And I want to make another new vertex tag. And let's hide our ground dynamics temporarily. So we got this nice fall off here. But I think we need to recreate a fall off that is very similar to what our eventual final shape is going to be. So we're going to need to make this one a little bit fancier. So we might need to steal a couple of things from our deformer, our plane deformer. So if we go into that fall off, you can see we've got this nice folder and this fall off. Now this base fall off I'm fine with, but let's go ahead onto these main cracks, and I think we might need that. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. We're going to go into this new vertex tag that we've created, and let's go ahead and name this one, I'm just going to call it Redshift. And on this one, we've already got this base vertex map that we're feeding in, which is looking good. But let's go ahead and see if we can paste in that additional cracks folder and everything that is contained within, and see if we can get that visually working, which is not necessarily a small feat, because I found doing copy and paste here can trip things up a little bit. So let's set that to normal, and let's see what we're getting. So we're feeding in this vertex map blur, and we're averaging it to be way bigger. So yeah, those, you can see where those cracks are existing, but they're not traveling too far on the outside. And then we have our edges. So let me think a little bit. And then we've got this curve, which is existing in a really strange spot. I think that was supposed to be above, which is interesting. You know what? I don't trust the copy and paste. It's just, that's what it comes down to. I think we can rescue this edge spline. So yeah, I can pull that edge spline in, and there we go. Now we can see the cracks that way. But I don't trust it combined with copy and pasting. It just doesn't consistently give me the results I'm looking for. So I'm going to, let's go ahead and create a folder, and we put the spline mask in there, and then we're gonna make a copy of our growth. And that's fine, but we need this growth to be really big. So I'm gonna go ahead and average that way more. So I'm going to blur it out more. So now you see it goes way out. And then I'm going to make a curve, and the curve can go inside there. And it's probably going to go into another folder, but let's go ahead and brighten this up quite a bit, because we want those cracks to be seen. And that seems to be working. That should work pretty well. Honestly, I feel like I want to blur it even more. So let's say 600, because we want this to be even bigger than what the final one is going to be. So cool, we got that. That is our vertex. That's a vertex map. In order for it to overlay the spline, I think we can say, move the spline above it and say multiply. Yeah, there we go. So now we got a multiplied on top of it. So we simplified that folder structure a little bit. And now we can just rename this one spline. And I'm going to tell this one to screen on top of the one below it. So now you can see we get the cracks and this nice fall off. That's working pretty well. We might end up feeding this even deeper into another level if this isn't quite giving us the strength that we need. I'm also a little bit inclined to make another curve, which is above everything, and just use that to brighten everything up here. So we're just going to brighten all those up. And we might, like I said, we might do another blur. But let's leave it at that right now. So now here's my thought. Let's go ahead and hide our ground reference. We can pull back our ground dynamics. And we can go ahead and take a look at our fracture again. Excellent. But now what we need to do is create a plane. And this plane is going to be, you guessed it, 2000 by 2000 by 1 by 1. And we're going to move it up into the air. 25 units will be exactly on the ground. I'm going to have it hover a little bit, 26. We could probably go a little bit lower. But this is just going to be above the ground a little bit. So I want this to look exactly like this material. So I'm going to copy our outer material on top of it. So it's got the 1.5 looping, and it's applied in the exact same way, looking great. But we don't actually want to work from that same material. So I'm going to make a duplicate, and I'm going to call this one ground fade. So it's the exact same material, but this one we're going to be driving with some fall off. So let's go ahead and double click it and go into our material editor. And let's go ahead and edit our shader graph. And we're going to be dragging, well, what do we need? We need to get some sort of opacity. So I'm going to go to overall. Let's make an opacity channel here. And in that opacity channel, we want to feed it a vertex. So I'm going to type in the word vertex, and there we go. We have a C4D vertex map. And now we can freely drag in a vertex map. And I want this one. So yeah, we get that vertex map. Actually, I don't think it automatically transfers. Yeah, we can't get an automatic transfer. So you know what? There's a small detail I almost forgot here, which is in our plane, we need this plane to also have the same subdivision. So I'm going to go 55 by 55. Otherwise, it wouldn't know what to do with it. And I think it needs the vertex map. So you know what? I'm going to make this editable, and we're going to feed it its own vertex map. So I'm just going to copy that one over. And inside of this vertex map, I'm going to delete everything, and we're going to feed it this other one. So it's going to be fed in there. So now it has its own vertex map. It's being fed directly on the actual object. And now we can safely, on this vertex map, let's go ahead and call this one Vertex Redshift, which I typed in wrong, Redshift 2. So let's go ahead and feed that one in. Boop. Okay, cool. Vertex map. Hopefully I haven't lost anyone there. So we have our vertex map. We can feed that in as the opacity. So let's just try doing that directly to start out with. And we'll deselect everything, and let's go ahead and, I'm going to make a wireframe again. Make a wireframe. We'll put that as our color output. And let's go ahead to our Redshift render view and let that chew on that for a moment, and let's see what we get. Okay, oh, did we, I don't think we replaced this material with our new one, so let's make sure we do that. And there we go. That has now updated, and there we go. Look at that. Okay, look at this. So you can now see that we are seeing our polygons in the center. So it's the opposite of what we want. So we need to invert our vertex map. So we click on our vertex map and just say invert. Very straightforward. So with that inverted, let's see what we get. Okay, nice. Look, we can see the cracks over there, and we can see all of our chunks coming up, but we get this nice crossfade into it so we don't see those other cracks. We need to push this a little bit further, though. And it's kind of cool that we copied it from one object to another, because now this plane object, we can go ahead and do things like blur it a little bit. So let's go ahead to our VertexMap field here, and let's go ahead and right now it's set to nearest, but we could say average, and yeah, you see that's going to blur it a little bit. I don't want to blur it too much, so let's say 50. And honestly, I don't even know if 50 does anything. So the original number was what? Oh, well, actually, the distance between those dots, I don't remember. I'm just going to keep guessing until I get a nice looking number. Let's try 35. I can't tell if that's blurred at all, so let's do 55. Okay, definitely blurred a little bit, which is good. And now that that's blurred a little bit, I'm going to add another curve, and we're going to once again maximize that a little bit. So it's really, we're erring on the side of making that brighter. And we can see it happening right now in real time in the viewport. Look at that. Look, our cracks are revealed underneath it, and everything else is faded out on the edge, so we don't even see it. We just need to make sure that this ends up being big enough that we're not sneaking through it. I don't want to crossfade through it. So we need to err on the side of going a little bit too far. So let's go ahead and increase this further. I'm going to say 75, and that should blur it more, which should expand these radiuses out a little bit more. Let's jump it to 111. I'm doing very small numbers. I should probably be doing bigger numbers. Yeah, you can now see they're blurring out further. And once again, we have our curve, and I'm going to emphasize that we need to go err on the outer part. And let's see, boom, there. Now you see we expanded more, and we're getting extra tiny little cracks on the edge. So that's working pretty well. The blurring, got to be careful, because blurring this, it's making it so that these cracks might be getting erased out a little bit on the end if we blur it too much. But I think that's working pretty well. I might pull this back a little bit just to get a little bit further in here. There we go. So that's looking pretty nice. I'm actually pretty pleased with that overall. So now that becomes transparent. Everything becomes transparent where there's a crack. And now if we allow our original color to go through and be our diffuse color, then this ground should become indistinguishable from the rest of our surface, except that we get a little bit of a shadow here. There's a little bit of shadow being cast. So let's go ahead and add a Redshift tag object, a Redshift object tab, and on the visibility tab, let's turn that on and override some things. I'm going to say that this new flat plane here, which is just, I don't know, let's just call it the eraser, that the eraser here, it is not casting ambient occlusion. It itself is not casting any shadow. It doesn't self-shadow. And let's see. Oh, there we go. Look at that. Boom, disappeared. So now that is hiding all those subdivision cracks that are everywhere, and it's just going to reveal them based on the exact same chain of vertex maps that are revealing the rest of them everywhere. And that is actually working pretty dang well. That'll just pass up through it in general as they crack up, but that is working pretty much perfectly as far as I can tell. Let's spin that around, make sure that the specular is looking nice. Yeah, look at that. I am quite pleased with what we are seeing here overall. Yep, fades out quite nicely there. So yeah, all those subdivision cracks are being hidden underneath it. If you have a different method there, I would love to hear it. But let's go ahead and give this a save. number 19. What a tutorial. And let's do a render of this thing and make sure everything is looking good, and then we'll do one last pass of any tweaks. All right, got a couple of little tweaks here I would like to do. Let's go ahead and take a look at the animation. Overall, this is working quite well, but if we look carefully, we can see it's fading in a little bit on the edge here as this animates through. And in fact, you can see some cracks happening further ahead significantly. That's not catching up. So I think these cracks are way too faded. And then even on these nearer parts, like these should be breaking up earlier than we're seeing them. So we just need the overall effect of this vertex map to be way stronger. So I think if we go back and we take a look at our main final vertex map here, I think what I would like to do is click on this vertex map, which is where I think we need to make most of the changes. So this is the original Redshift one that I named incorrectly. Redshift. If we go over there and we click on the fields, I'm going to lock that property so I have those controls, and then I'm going to click on this upper one, and we can now see the vertex map, and we're going to have to hit play and let this go forward quite a few frames. So let's let that chug along. We're going to see, let's see, we can even kind of see it happening here. So we can see this growth happen. That's looking good, but you can see some of these cracks here are appearing way ahead of it. So that is not nowhere near far enough, but let's let this go even a little bit further. And now we can start seeing these little tendrils arrive. So we need those tendrils to be way stronger. So I think, and now I'm actually looking at the properties of this one because that's where I locked it. So we've got our spline being affected in here, but our vertex map growth, I think that it's so blurred, we've got all this blur on it, that this curve by itself is not enough to pull it back up to a light enough color. So I'm actually going to duplicate that curve, and the instant that I do, I hope, give that a moment to, oh, there we go. So now you see that it took a second, but it refreshed, and you can see that we can see a lot more, so we can see this moving further down the line. These cracks are a lot more distinct. And with that in mind, potentially even brighten that up a little bit. The edge mode is getting multiplying on top of it, but I think I might want to increase our radius on that a little bit, so those should get a little bit thicker. Let's see what that does. It is updating, I think, various things. I didn't see much of a difference on that one, if it did at all. We've got our overall vertex map. Oh, there, it did. Actually, that made a huge difference. It's just taking a really long time for it to refresh, unfortunately. I'm gonna go back to 50 to chill that one out. And we've got our initial vertex map, which is a smaller one. I'm going to tell that one to be a little bit more blurred. So it's going to blur and then hopefully get a little bit bigger, but it might fade out. So it might not visually look terribly different. But if I click on the curve, then I should be able to, and you know what, this is all taking a lot of calculation time, but if we turn off our vertex map, or our Voronoi Fracture here, I think everything will speed up quite a bit. I'm going to grab our top curve here and pull that in quite a bit. And that, yeah, now we're getting much better feedback. So then you can see everything is scaling up. So everything got bigger. These lines are going way further out so that these edges are definitely getting more of their due. And that should be significantly better. So that screen's on top of it. The curve gets applied. That all feeds through. So I think that that should wrap up the actual part here. I will do one more render. First of all, remember to turn our fracture back on again. But one thing to note is if you hit render with this rig and it's played somewhere in the viewport, it might render the first frame with the animation not quite in this position. So make sure you always render it back at the time of 0, because it seems to have one frame of lag trying to catch back up to it. So, and then in the viewport, we can also visually hide this erase layer just so we can see our cracks a little bit better. It is the next day. I continued working on the scene file for a little bit, trying to prepare it for the final animation, and this is not at the full final rendered quality, but let's go ahead and take a look at this. And I'm quite pleased with the way that's all come together. There's definitely some things I would do pushing beyond this, but this tutorial is already 2.5 hours long, if not longer, so I don't want to spend much more time on it. But what I did want to do is, we're not going to go through it step by step. I want to talk about a couple of concepts I implemented in here to make this final animation. One of the first things you can see is if we let the animation as we had it continue, it's just going to dissolve all the way to the edge and the entire big square is going to fall away and there'll be nothing left. So I stopped that from happening. I also made it so that the ground level, the ground is expanded way beyond just the initial point. That I did in a very simple way. I just created another plane, made it 5 times bigger, punched a hole out from the middle, and applied the material in the same way. So it just perfectly matches. Our breaking one exists on one side, and then more is created beyond that. So that one's really straightforward. But I want to spend a little bit of time breaking down what I did to stop this from animating all the way to the edge. And it's actually pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and go to the bottom, and I'm going to turn off my fracture object. And let's take a look at my ground reference. And let's take a look at some of the different vertex maps that added on here. I made a couple of extra super crazy ones, but I want to take a look at, where did I put it? This one. I made this new limiter vertex map. So let's go ahead and hide our ground. And we've got a whole bunch of extra chunks in here I added in. Don't need those. So here is our brand new vertex map called the VertexMap Limiter. And what I did with this one is I made sure that I made a brand new spherical field. And the spherical field you can see here is just big enough to get around the edge of our overall object. And I made it a little bit beyond, and I gave it some fall off that goes a little bit inside. And then I created a new random field, which is a copy of our original random field, and I overlaid it inside of it. So there's an overlay, so it just gives these imperfections on the edge. So there is no growth, but all that's happening is I can now use this and add it to my other ones. I'm not even sure where I might have, yeah, like here's one where I've got my growth, and then I multiply our new limiter on top of it. And that just means when it grows, it can't grow beyond that point. So we never quite get to the edge. So when the dynamics are run, the dynamics can't get beyond it being locked into this point. So that part is very important. Another thing is we're having all that trouble with the fade out, and I was able to finally figure out why the fade out wasn't working too well. And it was actually pretty obvious once I figured it out. In our fade out material here, which I will pop open, the vertex map, we don't need that. The vertex map, no matter how we're feeding it in, has this little fall off on the side. So all I did was pump our vertex map through a color correct and crank the contrast all the way. So it's either on or it's off, and we don't get that smooth transition happening. Let's take a look at the final render and see if there's anything else worth mentioning. Taking that limiter and putting it in various places to stop the animation from traveling all the way to the edge. I just applied it in different places, but hopefully using some of the concepts we talked about, learning the way fields work, that helped a lot. And so go ahead and hopefully try and apply that concept by multiplying it in different places to the rest of the workflow, and you should be able to limit how far these different things grow. The last thing I want to mention is pretty important. I added in a shaking camera here. I used Gorilla Cam, another tool that I helped develop over at Grayscale Gorilla. And I just thought it'd be a cool way of getting some nice shaking animation going. But I wanted in Redshift to create some motion with motion blur. And Gorilla Cam had to be baked in order for that motion blur to work correctly, otherwise it refreshes quicker. And in addition to that, I found out that Fields suffers from the same problem. If you turn on motion blur and you use a freeze node and it has growth, which is how we're growing our initial, the initial growth here is all from our tiny spherical field spreading out via this freeze, which is growing. That refreshes super quick based on however many subframes, I guess, that Redshift is calculating from. So it made more and more and more, and everything would collapse in the pit really quickly. So I had to figure out a way around that, but there's no way of baking a vertex map. So I actually had to do a pretty strange workaround. And that is I made an entire copy of our ground plane, and I put a plane effector in it, and I turned that into a deformer. So it's deforming the points upward. And it's going to deform the points upward the exact amount, which is the distance of these points. So I'm moving up exactly 36.3464 upward. So if it's moved upward all the way, it's having no effect. And if it's not moved upward, then it's having a full effect. And what I did is I used our same vertex map, which would normally grow, it's just doing the normal growth, and I sent that over to this plane effector, and then I baked it using right-clicking on the object, going to character tags, using a point cache mode. So making that point cache mode, I then ran the entire simulation, and I baked out by storing the state and calculating, stored the entire state of the entire animation all the way through. So then essentially what I have is kind of a baked out version of a vertex map that I could then feed this back in again to the field. So instead of running that same simulation, I just drag that object back in, and as long as I use point mode and exactly that same distance, it treats it like a baked vertex map, in which case it didn't accelerate really quickly because of the growth happening. So that's just a cool way of baking it in. So if you're going to do motion blur and Redshift, that's definitely a necessary step. Otherwise, you get completely different speed. I think that covers everything else that I did in here. Keep in mind that I added in some extra chunks in here. I just copied our other one and made it so there'd be more little tiny chunks falling through. And I'm going to do another render tonight, which I think is going to take like 3 or 4 hours to get this entire thing animated. But the extra camera shake really helps sell it, I think. And you get the cracks moving around. And yeah, I'm just quite pleased with the way that ends up looking overall. So hopefully that wraps that up. Another giant epic tutorial from Rocket Lasso. Whew, you made it all the way through. That is a gigantic tutorial. I hope I have a goal of making some of the tutorials in the future not quite so long, but when we're tackling advanced dynamics things, it just takes some time. So we might be able to make more bite-sized things. And I've got, of course, a bunch of ideas for tutorials that have nothing to do with dynamics whatsoever. Now, important things to note here. It's very important to make these kind of things your own. Don't just recreate this tutorial like number by number and then put it on your reel. That's not what people want to see. People do not want to see exactly what they saw in a tutorial on a bunch of different people's reel. So go ahead and take this, make it your own. Go and do some camera matching and make it fall on the ground somewhere. Go and make it that a wall is collapsing. There's so many different ways of changing this and making it your own. So don't follow this, bit by bit, step by step, and then put that on your reel. That's not going to be any good for anyone, but it's really hopefully useful for learning the techniques. In addition to that, I want to say that there is an entire community of other artists around able to help and answer questions in the Rocket Lasso Slack channel. There's going to be a link in the description below on how to head on over to there, and that's just a great way to continue the conversation and ask questions and see what other people are working on. There's some really fun group projects in there, and I think you'd have some fun being in the Slack channel. In addition to that, liking the video, commenting below if you have any comments or critiques or anything I could improve or things you'd like to see in the future would be amazing. It really helps me out. And if you really like what's going on, then supporting on Patreon is the best way to enable me to make more of these tutorials. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next live stream or in the next tutorial. Bye-bye.